a very warm welcome to all of you, those who are present, and the very many who are also online. This is our first Radzinowicz Symposium, I think, and we're delighted to mark Peter Dawson's appointment to a Radzinowicz Fellowship. Where's Peter? He's out there somewhere. So we're marking it by organising this conversation on whether we punish too much. And part of the grand plan is to encourage greater dialogue between theorists of punishment and empirical scholars working on the experience of imprisonment. This represents the interests of the two research centres that are co-hosting this event, and hopefully this agenda already interests all of you. We hope it will be the beginning of many more exchanges. We have a few absences, including Julian Roberts, sadly, caused by COVID, and Richard Vince, caused by politics, I think. Both have sent their apologies. So my task is to hand over to our first speaker, Professor Leo Seibert, who will talk about punishment theory meeting punishment practice. Professor Nikki Hadfield will respond, and then we will open up for discussion. Please say who you are when we open things up for the discussion. It will just help things flow, and we'll get to know each other that way. So, Leo, welcome.
All right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. There's something that is not expressly stated in my slides, but I think will be obvious. I'm a philosopher. That's my training. I think it will be very clear why I'm saying this. So I want to start by discussing the ways in which, hold on, this is supposed to move. Hold on. Hold on. Okay, there it is. No, it isn't. Okay, so yeah, but it's okay. Okay, that's fine. So the philosophical definitions of punishment tend to be very general and thin. I'll give a couple of examples. So the most widespread definition of punishment, which is H.L.A. Hart and Stanley Benn and Anthony Flew states that punishment must involve pain or other consequences normally considered unpleasant. A different way of capturing that painful element of punishment is to refer to it as the hard treatment aspect of punishment. I have nothing against this sort of generality. In fact, I am as guilty as any other philosopher of having done that. Yet, in some contexts, that sort of generality strikes me as a little bit too bloodless, too sanitized, and then, for that reason, I have, later in my career, tended to highlight the centrality of suffering for punishment. I have been, colleagues I like very much have criticized me for using that term because it's a bit jarring or excessive, but I think it's important to highlight that that's what we're doing, part of what we're doing when we're punishing. There are many other things which are true about punishment, and many other things that we want punishment to accomplish, but one of them, as a definitional matter, is to make people suffer. I find it important to remember that the criminal justice system is, in part, I don't know what percentage, but in part is in the business of making people suffer, and I find that a very sobering reminder. Now, I want to talk initially, I only have 15 minutes, but initially about something that I'm calling the hard problem of punishment. I'm using the expression, echoing the expression that David Chalmers has used in the philosophy of mind to refer to something called the hard problem of consciousness. Very, very schematically, the problem is that suffering is prima facie, at least prima facie, bad. So how can it ever be good? Good somehow in itself. There's a lot of fact in this somehow, and we could discuss it later, but there is a sense in which making people suffer could sometimes be good in itself for me, and then that's a huge problem. Now, to refer to it as the hard problem faces difficulties. Steven Pinker famously, who is very sympathetic to Chalmers's approach, sort of criticized the fact that according to Chalmers's distinction between the hard problem and all the other ones, which are easy problems, then sending a person to Mars, or in fact curing cancer, will turn out to be easy problems. Now, I am inherent in that problem, given that I'm referring to this particular problem as the hard one. But I do not mean to suggest that all of the problems in criminology or in penal theory are easy, even though I want to believe, or I will try to suggest, that there is something uniquely difficult about that hard problem of punishment. Now, I'll just go very quickly through 3 reasons why talking about this hard problem of punishment is attractive to me. One of them is that some people in the case of the philosophy of mind deny that the hard problem of consciousness exists. Some people within penal theory would deny that the hard problem of punishment exists. This denial in the case of punishment theory is made a bit easier once, if we are using this overly general language. That, as I admitted, is sometimes necessary even, but still, the general language helps the denial of the existence of the hard problem of punishment. The other similarity that I find between Chalmers's approach and mine is that he rejects what he calls reductionist, mechanistic, algorithmic, or even scientific solutions to the hard problem of consciousness. And that is sort of my position regarding the hard problem of punishment in ways that I will very, very superficially touch in a couple of minutes. By the way, neither Chalmers, I am not against science. This is not my view, but there is something sometimes problematic about the typical scientific or, mechanical approaches to this. And then, just as Chalmers wants to take consciousness seriously, I wish to take suffering seriously. Now, the immense difficulty that I find in this problem is that taking suffering seriously does not mean trying to make sure that we never inflict it or to reduce it at all costs. So I want to take suffering seriously, but by that I do not mean I want to make sure that suffering does not exist and that we never inflict it. And that is a problem. The problem, in other words, is retributivism, which is a position that with many qualifications I endorse. I still consider myself a retributivist, even though some colleagues believe I no longer count as such. There's something about retributivism that I find necessarily part of the story, but then the story is immensely complicated. All right, so I am playing around with these charts, which are incredibly simplified, but I hope they will be useful in sharing the gist of what I mean. So imagine that you want to do this chart, and we have on the y-axis the severity of the punishment, and on the x-axis the gravity of the offense. So in theory, that's important because there will be a chart of retributivism in practice later on. But in theory, this is the chart that more or less captures the spirit of retributivism. As the offense gets more serious, then so does the condemnation, and so does the punishment. There is nothing particularly significant about the 45-degree angle. It could be a different angle going on, but it will always be increasing. That's the essence of the retributivist position in theory. Now, I'll very briefly share a couple of more charts having to do with options that I found, or I have found, far less attractive. So this is the chart for classical utilitarianism. It's not even clear to me how the classical utilitarian would agree to engage in this chart, because it's not that meaningful for her to be doing this, given that what matters is the utility, and utility is nowhere in this chart. But if I, hazard some sort of chart, it would be something like this. By the way, these are lines that I threw randomly into the chart, but they would correspond to those points that go up and down would correspond to whatever it is that has more utility. So if, for example, punishing less severely someone who
Sorry, apparently people on Zoom can't see the slides.
They cannot see the slides?
No.
Oh.
Sorry, everybody. It's bound. There's a structure below.
Okay, so you're gonna count these minutes. Okay.
Okay, hopefully that.
Is it going now?
Mhm.
Yes. Okay, and then we go, hold on. Okay. Well, I didn't, okay, you saw the chart with the those variations, because basically what matters is how does these improve society, using that as a synonym for utility. And now the punchline on this chart is halfway lost now. The point of the abolitionist position is that at no point you would inflict suffering, right? So it doesn't matter how serious the offense is, you stay at no suffering if possible. And those things do not seem attractive to me, but I want to very quickly sketch a different sort of support that I have found for retributivism as I understand it. For the next 2-3 slides, Peter Strawson would be playing a very, very important role. I am very influenced by that article, Freedom and Resentment, by him. So if you wish to treat any, including wrongdoers, as moral agents, if you want to speak what he calls the language of morals, you need to recognize the importance of what he calls the reactive attitudes. Only then can you genuinely countenance the ideas of desert, responsibility, guilt, condemnation, and justice. Once you speak that language, then you are led, quote, to acquiesce in that infliction of suffering on the offender, which is an essential part of punishment. I find several of his statements incredibly profound and beautiful. He says, our reactive attitudes do not merely exploit our natures, they express them. They reveal who we are. Human beings react in these ways. This is not a strategy, it's not a tool, it is just who we are. Now, in order to better understand what the reactive attitudes are, we should contrast them to, as Strawson did, to what he called the objective attitudes. And then he says, to adopt the objective attitude to another human being is to see him, perhaps, as an object of social policy, as a subject for what, in a wide range of sense, might be called treatment, as something certain to be taken account, perhaps precautionary account of, to be managed or handled or cured or trained, perhaps simply to be avoided. I put emphasis on something, which I think is clearly was not a mistake. It was meant to be that word, not someone. Now, insightfully, in my opinion, Strawson links this objective attitude to what he called an incomplete empiricism or a one-eyed utilitarianism. This is the same sort of approach that Chalmers rejects regarding the hard problem of consciousness, and that I want to reject regarding the hard problem of consciousness, and that I want to reject regarding the hard problem of punishment. Now, if your attitude towards someone is wholly objective, then though you might fight him, you cannot quarrel with him. And though you may talk to him, even negotiate with him, you cannot reason with him. You can, at most, pretend to quarrel or to reason with him. And in my opinion, if your attitude towards someone is wholly objective, then you can at most pretend to punish him. Strawson's simulacra remind me of Bentham's endorsement of hanging a man in effigy. His thought experiment was if you could accomplish whatever really hanging a man by hanging an effigy, then it would be folly or perversion, I think were the terms. It would be just wrong to actually carry out the hanging. So not only am I reminded of those of Bentham's approach, but of other approaches to the criminal justice system when they monistically seek to reduce the criminal justice to, say, a system of public health or quarantine, or a system of societal self-defense. I have nothing intrinsically against those dimensions of the criminal justice system, but I am very much against thinking that that's what the criminal justice system is in total, as it were. Now, from the perspective of those who emphasize the objective attitudes, the best punishment is fake punishment, as I think Bentham's example clearly indicates. All right, so I have to fly. Now, even if retributivism is better than the alternatives, and even if you are similarly attracted by Strawson's position on the reactive attitudes, there is something that remains disturbing about the retributive chart that I shared with you. Because whatever the angle is, 45-degree or another inclination, the retributivist account I shared permits or recommends actually incredibly excessive suffering to be inflicted upon those who do incredibly bad things. Now, so I have one more chart, which is the one I announced earlier, which would be the chart for retributivism in practice. Now, in practice, the chart of any retributivist I know, or almost anyone I know, certainly of these retributivists, the chart would look something like this. So at some point, the line would be flat. At some point, you stop going, up and up in the amount of suffering that you will inflict. The reasons why this is so, this was supposed to go, it's good, given the time. So a number of reasons explain why the line should become flat at some point. I think that developing a taxonomy of such reasons is a very attractive research plan. But the point that I'm in closing, I have, I think, one more slide after this one, I want to focus is that, so the point that I want to highlight is that, as many thinkers have emphasized, it is crucially important to emphasize that the kind of suffering that we're talking about here matters. It is not just any suffering that, even from the retributive perspective, is somehow good somehow in itself, but this qualitative distinction between different forms of suffering is terribly important. Some inflictions of suffering might be intrinsically bad, and what I think is perhaps even more worrying is that some of those inflictions may undermine the salutary effects, to give them a name, of the right sort of suffering that a retributivist should be committed to. So, one need not agree, say, with Camus' extreme view of suicide as the only serious philosophical problem in order to be deeply concerned about the frequency with which flesh and bone people contemplate or attempt or succeed in committing suicide. Prison need not be pleasant, but it should not be the stop of nightmares either, as it unfortunately is very often. Arguably, the level of despair that might lead someone to contemplate or attempt suicide in prison is clearly above the flat line that I was describing. I have not given any indication exactly where to draw that line. At some point it exists, and it is clear to me that to be thinking about ending your life is above that line. But what is also important, I think it would also be that the chart for the first chart of retributivism without the flat line will also reveal that level of anguish to be above the deserved punishment. So even if you go with the theoretical retributivism I presented earlier, things like these would be, from the retributivist stance, at least the one I am defending, would be shown to be excessive. Now, similarly, investigating the depth, weight, tightness of the suffering actually experienced by those upon whom it is actually inflicted is likely to result in a much less reductive conclusion than those that may be spun, however unwittingly, by the language often favored or indeed necessitated by theoreticians. So these two paragraphs, I hope is clear. I'm nodding to my colleagues, Alison Lidlin and Ben Crew, and their work on prisons and the way in which people in prison actually live their suffering. And by our multiple conversation, I've been convinced that that sort of suffering is actually quite distant from the sort of suffering that even these retributivists might ever be, acquiescing in. All right, thank you very much.
You've done it again, you stopped the screen sharing.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's fine.
Using.
Oh, I see.
Thank you very much, Leo. You always give so much food for thought. Do we punish too much? I'm astonished that that's the title of this talk in a way, because of course we punish in quite the wrong way. So does everyone think we don't punish enough? Put your hand up if you think we don't punish enough. Oh, Justice, I thought your hand went up. Anyhow, I'm here with 5 minutes, of which I'm wasting it, to talk about punishment theory meets punishment practice. So I think I've been invited with my judge hat on. There isn't another judge in the room, is there? There are some magistrates, or at least one magistrate in the room. And how would I want to respond to Leo as judge? I was a judge for about 14 years, and I did it for 5 or 6 weeks a year, and I think I sentenced about 300 people. I don't remember all 300, but I remember a lot of them. My friends used to say, is it fun being a judge? And I have to say it was not fun being a judge. It was endlessly interesting, and I would do it again in many ways. It was endlessly interesting, but it was a completely bonkers system. You weren't encouraged to talk to that person in the glass box at the back of the room. The lawyers who addressed you were not on your side. They weren't even necessarily on his side. The system was weird. The training was really weird. It was all about this proportionality of graphs and what you give people. It wasn't about what works to reduce reoffending and the things which I think might have been more useful. And it was really difficult. I was appealed successfully twice in my career as a judge. One sentence went down from 18 months to 9 months. One sentence went up from 9 months to 18 months. I think that means I did rather well. But what a waste of time worrying about 9 months, 18 months when the HDC rules just changes everything. It has no meaning whatsoever. And so the other thing which I think I would say as a judge was, which was really depressing, was the really low expectations of those people I was sentencing. One of the cases I remember very clearly is I'd just given a really, by my standards, very long sentence to somebody, and he was a rather unattractive person. This is being recorded. Yes, sorry. And I gave up my sentence. I did my sentencing remarks as you have to, and then he stood up in the dock. One of the things which is really interesting is how do you end your sentencing remarks? You do not say, take him down, which they always do in the films. Maybe some judges do. It's really difficult. I would say something rather pathetic like, that's it. And then to get the message that it was time to go. And this bloke said, can I just say something? And all my judicial training said, no, your lawyer will be coming to see you in the cells later. Take him down. So I said, of course. And he said, I just want to say, miss, that I think you've been really fair. And I longed to say, wow, I'm sitting here wondering whether I've been rather unfair. Can we have a good discussion, you and me in the box over there? And of course we never did, but I think about that. Another thing I thought I would mention very briefly is that I changed my mind once on a sentence, and I mention this very, very rarely because I'm embarrassed by it. My judge friends think I'm completely wet and weedy, and I think my liberal friends probably think I'm wanting their praise. But I gave an IPP in 2006 when IPPs were pretty basic and you had to give them. And I went home and I thought, I can't believe that I've just given that young man a life sentence for persistently stealing people's mobile phones. It was quite clear that that's what I had to do. I rang up a judge, I said, I'm having sleepless nights about this sentence. He said, drink more wine, Nikki. And in the end, I thought, I cannot live with having given this young man a life sentence. Brought it back on, got him, re-sentenced him, took away his life sentence. His lawyer then wrote to me afterwards a wonderful letter. And I say it now because there are too many judges out there saying, we didn't realise that IPP was a life sentence. Oh, yes, they did. Of course they knew that IPP was a life sentence. And the judges are responsible for all those people who are in prison with IPP. So the burden of being judge is huge. To go to Leo before I run out of my 5 minutes, I really don't get why punishment has to involve pain or suffering. I don't get why we could discuss the difference between pain and suffering, or what is the right kind of suffering. What we have to recognise is that it usually does involve foul suffering. And our prisons today, I think it must be really difficult being a judge if you're reading all those chief inspector reports on prisons and you say to somebody, you're getting 9 years, you probably do go home and drink too much wine. So I don't see why it has to. I really don't get the why it has to. It does. The criminal justice system, to quote Leo, is in the business of making people suffer. Yes, it does make people suffer hugely, but why does it have to do? That's where I'm a bit lost. I am his one-eyed utilitarian. I remain a one-eyed utilitarian who still thinks you should only make people suffer if it's useful. And if it's not useful, why on earth are we doing it? There's something really creepy about being a judge who says, go away and suffer, because that's what I'm giving you as a punishment, because we've got to think, I think, quite a lot harder about that. The last thing I would say is that you argued that if the judge tries to be too objective, then there's a problem there in relation to how you reason with someone. And I think it's really interesting to reflect upon who the judge is talking to when they sentence someone, because they're not really talking to the person in the box at the back of the room. They're talking to the media, to the Court of Appeal, to their mates, to the victims, all sorts of people. So the message is a really, really difficult message. It is a really hard problem, punishment. We've got to define it. The law is hopeless. It says one of the purposes of sentencing is punishment, which feels to me rather circular because we haven't really worked out what punishment is. I think you're wanting to argue that one of the purposes of sentencing is to make people suffer. And that takes me back to the last point again, which is, surely as a judge, I should be able to say, I'm not sending you to prison. I'm going to defer your sentence. And if you can go on sorting your life out, you're not going to prison. Or whatever. So I think there's a lot further that I want to go in relation to thinking about what the judge is actually doing when they sentence somebody and why it has to involve necessarily suffering. But I'll sit down and maybe come back later.
Please say who you are before you speak.
I'm the doctor from Stirling. I pick up on the point about suffering. I can make punishment definitionally imposing suffering. There's a very, very broad definition of suffering. Think of probation or community service. Do they involve suffering? Not in the ordinary sense. And you focus too much on prison. A bit other kinds of punishment. You make a hard problem seem much broader than it is. Punishment didn't involve suffering. It was a burden, certainly. Suffering seems to me to be true of only some punishments.
You're completely right. There's my emphasis on the word suffering is a strategy to try to make more prominent what is happening when we punish. I think part of what is happening is definitionally a matter of making people suffer. Now, what exactly is the type of suffering that is conceptually linked to punishment is the crucial question. And it is the question that I think an event like this could spawn for further work. But I think that in terms of policy, probably we agree on a lot. All that I am trying to insist is that the reactive attitude of resentment, of disappointment, whatever the exact is a real thing, and it better be part of the story. Now, often, even though it is part of the story, it would lose out to other considerations and other goals that the criminal justice system in particular should be interested in bringing about, including rehabilitation and reconciliation and so on and so forth. But all I want to insist is that there is something uniquely human about caring about the deserved suffering. That's why I find it so hard. I want to take seriously the suffering and the reactive attitudes, and some of the reactive attitudes call for mercy and kindness and things other than just bringing about this particular thing, if it is. So I'm not disagreeing. I think I'm not, but I think you think we are.
If I could add just one thing also, that as a one-eyed utilitarian, I love it, your chart about utilitarians is really unfair, because utilitarians aren't mad. They don't have lots of crazy intentions. what they believe in proportionality as much as anyone else, surely. Because nobody believes in disproportionate sentences. It'd be really odd to say I believe in disproportionate sentences. They just don't hang so much on the concept. Nobody would respect the system if it wasn't basically consistent. So I thought you were very unfair on the utilitarian.
So I confess to some sort of, what's the word, strategic unfairness in the chart. However, the utilitarian, the Bentham utilitarian, the one utilitarian would only care about proportionality insofar as it works. Not in, I think you're right. If you had a grossly disproportionate system, it would. But that's the same or a similar argument for the importance of the deserved suffering. If you have a system in which the penalties are completely out of line with some sort of ordinary understanding of what works, and sorry, what is deserved and what's not, that would be problematic. You're right in the big picture that it's a tendentious chart. Well, it is not invented. I mean, I just look, there is something to it, given the intermediation that the utility would know, even for utilitarian interest in it.
We also have a question online from David Howard to Leo. You can see it on the screen there. Characteristically incisive. Something about the taxonomy of pain. That would it help to clarify the amount of subjective suffering, or are all pains of punishment equally non-starters in this context? And if we might have to stop this session in a minute or two and hand over to the next, but people can save some of their questions for you.
Oh, that's a very good and complicated question.
Very good, complicated.
So I
Maybe we should stop there.
complicate somehow.
Very much. And then
Musical chairs.
Yeah, she knows that she's one eye you
Straight along in order to keep to time. Those of you who can read will be a bit puzzled that I'm clearly not Leo Zybert, who's the person who's supposed to chair this. My name's Matt Travers. But since Leo has just spoken and since he's chairing my session later, it seemed both unfair to him and possibly to all of us to have Leo for such a length of time. So I offered to do this. Time is short, so we'll move straight to Professor Alison Liebling, and then on Zoom we have Professor Nikki Lacey. Alison.
thank you very much. Thank you. You will think that Leo and I have prepared our papers together, I think, but we haven't, I promise. Now, let me just make sure I can move it. Thought this microphone. For some reason, I can't move my screen on.
Click on slideshow. Go.
Oh, okay. So slideshow. Yes. That's it. Yes. Thank you. That's it is sharing. Yeah. Okay. So I wondered when I carried out this interview if we mean to destroy people's personalities when we punish. I also wondered when I co-supervised a PhD on euthanasia requests by long-term prisoners in Belgium, whether the intense mental suffering that justified such a request might be linked to aspects of the quality of life in particular prisons, and it was. Linked to the fact that much of my early research life involved the study of suicide attempts in prison, my natural inclination was to regard the suffering I witnessed as wrong, regretful, and damaging. It never occurred to me, till I met Leo, that there might exist apparent moral justifications for it. The prison officer in visit who said, "That's what I like to see," when a young man cried helplessly at the end of his visit during my first ever research project, made me deeply uncomfortable. I now see that he was a retributivist of a certain kind who welcomed the hard treatment aspect of punishment. Many prison officers are revenge retributivists. Here's some of their negative views. Some Home Secretaries are too. David Blunkett remarked that he was tempted to open a bottle of champagne when serial killer Dr. Harold Shipman took his own life in Wakefield Prison. I was mid-evaluation of a prison suicide prevention strategy at the time and felt frustrated and disappointed at these remarks, not because Shipman had escaped his punishment, but because a prison sentence should not be a death sentence, in my view. Leo argues that punishment is sometimes justified and it brings with it irresolvable conflicts. But how much suffering, as he asks, caused by which aspects of punishment is justifiable or successful in motivating reform? When does punishment become just more violence? The main question I want to address today is how we know when the amount of suffering being inflicted is excessive. I have some other questions too, which I've not answered yet. Am I still against suffering in general? Does the cause or the timing of the suffering matter? What's the relationship between changes in sentencing and the amount of suffering generated by the prison experience? I started to hear far more agonising and disturbing accounts of experience from long-term prisoners and complaints about the illegitimacy of their sentences from around 2009, when I returned to a high-security prison I'd studied 10 years earlier. This felt heartbreaking and pointless. I'm in the process of writing a book that synthesises my empirical work on the experience and effects of imprisonment over the last 20 years. My working title is Aristotle's Prison, A Search for Humanity and Justice. Most of the book tries to describe and explain, more systematically than I have before, the relationships between prison moral climates and outcomes, including suicide, anger, violence, and at the other end of what seems to be a continuum, survival and personal growth. Drawing on differences between prisons, as well as declining moral quality over time, I show that we know a great deal about what safe and survivable prisons look like, but we've stopped aiming for them. Instead, we're generally creating cruel and inhuman prisons by design. They still differ, however, and one of the key comparisons in the book is between a high-security prison that created anger and violence and one that facilitated the kind of journey of the self that interests desistant scholars. These two prisons, Frankland and Full Sutton, resemble Whitemore 1, a study I carried out with David Price in '98, and Whitemore 2, a study I carried out in the same prison 10 years later, suggesting that whatever's going on nationally, prisons still differ in typical forms. I'm claiming that in Frankland's Pipe in particular, but also in the prison more generally at the time that we studied it, prisoners felt human and so evolved emotionally and morally, as well as behaviourally. Being treated as a thou, as I like to put it, or experiencing subject, helped them to find or become a better I. Prisoners at the angry I-it prison, where they were treated as experienced objects, suffered more and felt their experience to be more punishing. They reported less shame for their offences, although now I wish I'd measured remorse rather than shame, and they resorted to violence and power-seeking more readily than their peers in Frankland. It looks then like there's an inverse relationship between pain and suffering, the growth of agency, moral feeling and repentance, and other qualities linked to future prospects. There was certainly less violence at the I-thou prison. Prisoners often stress the moral or existential aspects of this process in their accounts of their expansion at Frankland, and link this to specific aspects of the prison environment. My account suggests that most of the suffering experienced during a prison sentence is to do with the conditions of imprisonment, and that very little of it is to do with the offence. Where prisons are less painful and where skilled staff help and support them, some prisoners come to unlearn and regret their violence repertoires. This is a long and arduous process. It's far more common for prisons to bring about excessive suffering, which saps or distorts the life force. So my comments today will run a section in my still in progress last chapter, in which I argue based on empirical data that just punishment is impossible in unjust prisons, and that punishment as it's currently delivered crossed an illegitimacy threshold about 15 years ago in relation to both its quality and its quantity. It brings about a form of suffering that may inhibit remorse while provoking anger and distress. During a major suicide prevention evaluation, I describe in one chapter, we invited prisoners to agree or disagree with the item, life in this prison involves a great deal of suffering. We asked this question as a way of exploring distress and suicide rather than testing theories of punishment, but the study showed that higher levels of reported suffering were significantly associated with higher suicide rates in all 12 prisons. The level of agreement with the suffering item ranged from about 60% in the poorest quality prisons to around 26% in the better quality prisons. Eastwood Park, which was the only prison that successfully implemented the strategy, and it's now become a case study in my book, suicides amongst women prisoners were highly prevalent at the before stage, when the average level of agreement with this item was 56%. Suicides ceased at the latter stage 2 years later as staff-prisoner relationships and levels of care, safety and support in the prison improved. Agreement dropped to 33%. Most prisoners reported less suffering and distress and more hope. How should we think about this information? How much of the suffering reported by women at Eastwood Park was justified by their wrongdoing or could be said to constitute deserved punishment? What are the limits of human suffering? At what point does it kill the human spirit? One of the arguments in my book is that research on suicide attempts in prison has helped us identify the moment when the mind opts for death, as Camus put it, indifferent or brutal treatment for others, by others, and the suffering caused as a result are major contributors to these moments. The suffering item was not used in subsequent studies because it was linked to suicide risk, but I've used a related item, my experience in this prison is painful, in all the studies I've carried out since 2001. Another relevant item, my time here seems very much like a punishment, has also been used since then. So perhaps unsurprisingly, prisoners describe their experience in Full Sutton as significantly more painful and punishing than at Frankland. Here I show the mean scores and percentages of prisoners agreeing with these items. Frankland's painfulness score is just above 3, which we generally treat as positive. This isn't much above 3. Most prisoners in both prisons agree that their time in this prison feels very much like a punishment, but the mean score is significantly higher, better at Frankland. Punishment or the deprivation of liberty is intended to be unpleasant, but should it be painful? Should it involve the deprivation of personality or growth? Gratuitous suffering is unlikely to encourage either growth or repentance and remorse. This prisoner puts it very eloquently. He's kicking the dog example, and talks about how it kills the person and creativity and potential. So what makes punishment legitimately unpleasant rather than life-threatening? In a regression model, I found that the painfulness of prison is mostly explained by deprivation of autonomy or liberty, lack of humanity, organisation and consistency, decency and responsiveness, poor staff-prisoner relationships, and lack of respect. In other words, we add to the painfulness of prison by making it inhumane, disorganised, indecent, and unresponsive, by allowing staff-prisoner relationships to disintegrate, and by disrespecting cultures. The feeling of punishment is mostly explained or made more intense by lack of responsiveness or moral ground, fairness, autonomy, decency, and humanity. John Braithwaite argued that offenders should be punished in ways that shame in a reintegrative rather than stigmatizing way within a continuum of human respect. Durkheim suggested that painful punishment exceeds a legitimate or meaningful tipping point when it weakens rather than protects morality. Prisons in general fail to cultivate regret, as Dostoevsky shrewdly observed. So can we identify a point at which this becomes more rather than less likely? One of the things that got me thinking about the relationships between prison climates and the cultivation of moral virtues was that in Frankland, my vow prison, a number of prisoners described the painfulness of coming to realise the nature and extent of the harm they'd caused others. This realisation often occurred late in their prison experience, following years of defiance, avoidance, and denial. The process started under supportive and often therapeutic conditions, not under conditions of intensely painful imprisonment. It was more self-generated than imposed, as Jessica Bird put it. Drawing on Benjamin Ewan, I suggest that prisoners in Frankland had more opportunities that were less available to them in Full Sutton, or they had more of a chance to change and grow because they were less preoccupied with their own pain, anger, and survival. Staff believed in their potential, but in a very finely tuned way. 3 of the items in our extended dimension, personal development, might be said to reflect an approximation of this concept of moral opportunity. These 3 items are intended to capture attitudes towards the experience of change. The differences are significant and in inverse relationship to the painfulness of their experience, as you saw earlier. Significantly more prisoners at Frankland reported that their time here seems like a chance to change, that they felt able to grow and develop, or felt able to find ways of becoming a better person in this prison. The direction in which these significant differences point suggests that highly painful or punishing experiences do not help people to grow and develop as human beings. The relationships are exactly the other way around. The dimensions that explained most of the variance in this new growth dimension were personal autonomy, help and assistance, staff-prisoner relationships, and humanity. So positive change and growth is facilitated by higher scores on these dimensions. Okay. In Frankland's better moral climate, positive identity formation was possible. Prisoners were more likely to discover and develop their own virtues, tolerance, reflexivity, self-control, responsibility, and competence, as well as their own agency. Some began to will the good for themselves in a natural process of personal emergence, as I describe at length in the book. In Frankland's Pipe in particular, the sentence came with new windows of opportunity, new self-stories that permitted the preservation or building of a positive self-concept. The I appeared as an actor in a growth story. These opportunities to develop their moral capacities were supported by staff. The prisoner's responsibility was not total, an all or nothing struggle between a monster identity and entrenched defensive denial. It was found. The change process was influenced to a significant extent by the moral climate in the prison. So my final slide is a very tentative look at one shame item from the dimension political charge. It's not the same as remorse, but there's some difference here, and it's in the expected direction and approaching statistical significance. Building on the work of Jevons, Jarman, Crew, and Hulley, I think this avenue is important and should include an exploration of how moral climates shape these trajectories. One second. So I want to say that wrongdoing and suffering are bound together in deep and complex ways. It's me. Perhaps some limited, proportionate, morally legitimate forms of imposed suffering may bring about moral learning or development. My observation is that the growth and change made possible by sanctions may act as precursors to remorse if the right support is made available. So Alice Jevons has proposed that a potential goal for state intervention might be to create the conditions in which people can express and feel remorse. Punishment should surely avoid working against this. My work shows, I think, that just punishment, to the extent that it's possible in an unjust society, is more likely to bring about better outcomes of all kinds than unjust punishment. This is not a utilitarian argument, but a claim about human nature and the centrality of justice in our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And then do we have to, so we make Nikki big?
Give us a second, Nikki. We're just going to
too far.
take the slide off and put you up, and right, you're looming over us all. So it's a delight to ask Nikki Lacey to comment.
Thanks so much, Nat. Thank you, Alison. And first of all, I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'd really have loved to have been. Unfortunately, I've been in a meeting all morning. But fantastic talks, both of the ones I've been able to attend. And Alison, I think the main thing I want to say at the beginning of my 5 minutes, I really can't wait to read your book. So I really, really do look forward to that. And I've looked forward to it in part because, as you know, and many of you there know, I too have been working on sort of some of these bigger concepts and their application to criminal justice, decency, forgiveness, apology, mercy, and so on. So it's something I also share an interest in with Leo, of course. But I think what's really powerful about your paper is the way in which you remind us that the other side of the, as it were, moral and psychological reality of punishment is incredibly important to our normative thinking, our moral and political thinking about punishment. So I think that's incredibly productive. And I would also just like to say that I really salute you for doing this work. It must be incredibly stressful and, you know, sometimes very distressing. But you've given us this sort of window, you and your colleagues, which is so incredibly valuable and sort of morally important, if I can put it that way. Now, I have to say, and I'm really chiming in with Nikki here, I definitely am in the camp that finds the idea that of the state intentionally setting out to cause suffering really difficult to swallow. You know, I know that there's, you know, the indirect effect argument is a controversial one, but it does seem to me that it's one thing to realise that punishment, because of its nature, is likely to cause certain kinds of, you know, unpleasantness or whatever. But the idea that we actually deliberately set out to do that is really hard for me to take. And I think, therefore, I'm very much in the, you know, insofar as I'm a retributivist, which I'm not, because like Nikki, I'm basically a one-eyed consequentialist. But I would be of the sort of von Hirsch and Anthony, some of your later work in which you've sort of sidelined that definitional role of suffering. But that, of course, leaves in place what you're concerned about, Alison, which is revealing and measuring, in some sense, and dealing with the reality of this suffering. And here I find myself really coming back to a sort of conceptual problem for me with retributivism, which is, you know, is this idea that there is a sort of notion of proportionality that we can somehow find that would calibrate and help to justify whether it's suffering or unpleasantness or whatever it might be. And I suppose my feeling is that the real challenge here is, with a small p, a political challenge. It's a challenge of having a sort of conversation with one another about how, as a political community, about what is acceptable by way of punishment and what isn't. And unfortunately, we seem to be in a world now where we have this conversation, lots of little silos. You've given us some data there on the prison officers. We all know about certain kinds of print and social media. But we also know from research, some of which you've mentioned, and you know, lots of other research, Julian Roberts' research, for example, that when you put questions to people in a different and more contextualized way, you often get a much more nuanced response in terms of what counts as appropriate and acceptable for the state to do by way of response to a crime. And that, I think, is why this empirical work is so incredibly important. But now I want to just sort of finally abut Anthony's comment about, you know, we're so mesmerized by the prison. Now, I mean, we must be mesmerized by the prison in a way, because it is so damaging, so harmful, so costly in so many ways. But it is a real problem that it's become such a sort of paradigm and a go-to institutional mechanism, it seems to me. And it's a problem not only because we know how much suffering it inflicts, but also because that suffering is invisible to most people except sub-communities who are either relatively politically voiceless, the relatives of most prisoners, for example, or people who work professionally who in the system and who become desensitized to it. And I think that's in part what is going on. And it's also, of course, exacerbated by the relatively low social status of a lot of people, felt low social status of a lot of people who work in prison, so they feel there's a kind of less eligibility psychology going on. So I think this work you're doing of trying to make the closed world of the prison more visible is sort of massively important and consequential work. And I, you know, so I'll end up where I started, which I really look forward to reading your book.
Okay, so we have about 8 minutes for questions. So I don't know everyone's name, but there is no valid inference to status from the fact that I don't get out a lot.
But do say who you are.
But do say who you are. Anthony, I do know your name.
Alison, did you talk much about different kinds of pain when asking the questions about painfulness? The pain of being humiliated, the pain of it being very difficult, the pain of crime.
Not in this study, but I've gone back to my first studies of suicides in prison, where I asked about the motive for suicide, like for the attempt. And in both the young offender and the adult study, the offence, guilt about the offence, was given as a reason for the suicide attempt in 2 cases in young offenders, and about 24% in the larger study of adult offenders. And the figures were much bigger for things to do with prison. That was the largest category, about 45% in the young offender study, and more than that in the adult study. And then there was another category, I couldn't decide where to put it, which was outside problems to do with lack of contact with the family. And I did think that maybe you can't completely separate, without knowing much more about it, you can't completely separate that from the offence. That will obviously have an impact on family relationships. But my overall assessment was that far more of the pain that was being reported was to do with the prison than to do with the offence. And I think that's why I snuck in a question about timing, because I wonder whether feelings, that the painfulness of feelings about the offence, I think Ben's work with his colleagues is suggesting that feelings about the offence may change quite dramatically over time. And I was certainly seeing prisoners 10 or 12 years in, at which point they were starting to have feelings about the offence.
Yeah, I'm just going to try and read these while I'm going to try and multitask. My wife would be laughing if they're Please go ahead, say who you are.
My name is Natalia. I want to ask you a philosophical question, and even though I don't agree with Professor Seibert, I will play on his side this time. I know he will be happy with this. And I want to make the point about acknowledging that we are causing suffering, and that's the goal with criminal justice system. Actually makes a point about limiting suffering, because while we acknowledge that we are causing suffering, we say that this suffering is not to be delivered because it is not deserved. It is not just. So if we don't take a retributive point of view, how would you limit suffering?
Yeah. I can see the struggle. It's a bit like when people call a young offender prison a secure school, it doesn't get inspected by people who are interested in power and authority, because they inspect it as if it's a school. And I think Pat Carlin wrote a really powerful article about how we should talk about how prisons are meant to make people suffer, and then measure their effectiveness on that score. And then at least we'd be being more explicit, which is, I think, what Leo was getting at. And I'm with Nikki, and that's why I'm asking myself this question: have I been persuaded by Leo yet that there is some to punishment and suffering? And I find it a really, really difficult question. The people who are persuading me at the moment are the people who, I think Martin Brady, who's written a book about punishment and suffering and virtue, who argues that if we mean what we say when we devise the penal law, if we think the rules matter, there has to be some kind of negative consequence to not upholding the law. Or we're saying to victims, we don't really mean that we want you to be protected from these offences. So I think I haven't completely rejected the idea of legitimate suffering, but I think we have to be really, really careful about it. It definitely shouldn't be life-threatening suffering.
I'm going to pick up two questions from the webinar, and actually something that Nikki said. So the first one's from Anonymous. Thank you for the critical work. Some of my clients have actually said they would find meeting the person they found more difficult than seen as punishment versus doing time. And then Rob Canton asks, should we stop talking about the philosophy of punishment and ask instead how to respond to criminal wrongdoing, a philosophy not of punishment, but of responding to wrongdoing? So, I guess putting those two together with something Nikki said, The thought, and Peter, and the thought might be, do we go down the wrong definition? Is our whole inquiry shaped by the fact that we start, let's think about punishment and in many cases prisons, when we could be thinking about wrongdoing and community services, restorative justice, all kinds of things. So we sense the frame of reference seems to push us in a direction which many of us are uncomfortable.
I think I agree, and actually I've cited an article by Nikki and Rob, where you say something about needing this response, a response to criminal wrongdoing. And I think I'm also not sure at all about the concept of punishment, I realise. I just don't see the point of it. It honestly feels to me as if we need to stop the behaviour. Right? And sometimes you have to stop the behaviour by putting someone in prison because they don't get it. And there's no alternative. But punishment, the more I read and think about it, the more I play with my data and the more I experience the reality of it in the real world, the less I understand it as a concept. Yeah.
It's all cahoots. So we'll squeeze in one last question very quickly. Yeah, please say who you are.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dan White. Short to ask Alison, in terms of that small section of positive responses you had about personal growth, were they in spite of the pain and suffering, or the sort of transcendence of that pain and suffering? Where did those positive responses come from?
I've been looking for that, and I don't think it is that. I think there was something about the place I was at the time. It was the pipe. Franklin was in a good shape, and there were people who'd been through 10 or 15 years of horrible prison experience, and then they land here, and it was something about the way they were treated by staff, that they were being, and I've got a whole chapter on this describing it, that they were understood and responded to, and their behaviour was discussed, and it was like a learning process. And now that I'm kind of seeing it, I'm starting to read it in biographies too. So when James talks about this, Jimmy Boyle talks about it, that what I want to say is that you have to be treated as a thou before you can even start on this road. You have to see yourself as a whole person with potential before you start to understand that other people are whole people with potential, and that's a kind of moral learning process. And I think prisoners were describing something like that in a really, really special place where staff were really, really highly skilled and nobody was doing punishment of any sort.
Okay, we've reached the end. We have a 25-minute break. But first, can we thank the utterly fabulous Alvin?
Welcome back to the second of 3 parts of this afternoon. I'm Ben Crew. I'm just chairing this session, so I'm going to do very brief introductions. Our speaker is Peter Dawson. Peter is a former civil servant, then he was a prison governor, and then he was director of the Prison Reform Trust. And now he tells me he's mainly claims of. Is that right, Peter? And then our respondent is Tom Wheatley, who again was a prison governor, technically still is a prison governor, and is also the president of the Prison Governors Association. So you've probably heard Tom on the radio speaking out about the state of our prison system recently. Right, so same format as before. Peter has about 15 minutes. Tom has 5 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions. Thank you, Peter.
Right, there are no slides. If someone crawls up to the lecture, and it's because something's gone wrong with me rather than something that it is very humbling to be standing here as the Radzinowicz Visiting Fellow. I'm conscious not only of the accomplishments of previous incumbents, but also of the very enviable standing of the institute that Sir Leon founded in 1959. And I'm very grateful to Ben and Alison and Manuel for the invitation to be that visiting fellow. I spent my entire career realising in each new role how little I had understood during the previous one. And I've been getting that sense again through my interactions with the student body here. They challenge both through the quality of their thinking
and also because of the range of perspectives they offer from across the world with so many different personal and professional backgrounds. For these few remarks, I will draw on what I've seen and heard during my career, and in particular on some discussion groups I've been fortunate to hold with prisoners over the last 6 months or so. But if there is insight from that process, it comes from the exchange of perspectives and ideas, followed by the luxury of personal reflection, rather than any pretense to be indifferently reporting the opinions of either prisoners or those who work in prisons. I've made a very good living from punishment, and that should make me worry. What kind of person wants to earn their living by making sure someone else suffers? It ought to be a deeply uncomfortable experience. Insofar as it addresses the issue explicitly, the prison service corporately has in recent years tended to rely for moral justification on a rather uneasy combination of a duty to deliver the sentence of the court, sitting alongside a rehabilitative ambition. A moral stance concerning the way punishment is delivered, rather than its purpose or outcome, has been less evident than it once was. I struggle to accept either public protection or rehabilitation as sufficient justifications for how I spent my professional life. Instead, I came to see imprisonment as a necessary evil. Regulated retribution as obviously preferable to unregulated retribution, satisfying a requirement that appears common to all human societies in one form or another. But a task once undertaken that should impose unusually high moral standards in a context where they will usually come under unusually severe pressure. The way in which punishment delivered was, for me, the critical factor in dealing with the moral hazard of doing it at all. And I was lucky that for most of my career, the direction of travel supported that approach. Setting a moral standard for the way the prison operated felt largely within the prison's control. Do that, albeit imperfectly, and I could sleep more easily at night. By the same token, not delivering on the promise of humane custody was the systemic equivalent of throwing a prisoner's application in the bin or going off shift without facilitating the promised phone call. But I suspect my successors have faced a problem that I did not, or not to the same degree. Because where punishment exceeds what is sufficient to its core purpose of proportionate regulated retribution, it ceases to be legitimate. The authority of prison managers or staff to set a moral standard, still less to expect others to keep it, is undermined. In my view, the punishment of imprisonment now exceeds what might be considered proportionate in at least the following ways. There are intended, or in some cases negligent, excesses. They include very long sentences, often for the young and immature, which are no longer seen as legitimate retribution and deny hope. Quixotic release procedures, arbitrary recall arrangements, and the prolonged detention of people who are unconvicted, innocent, or who have served beyond the period deemed appropriate for retribution by the court. Each of these are the product of deliberate policy, typically made without serious discussion of its contribution to the moral hazard of punishment. The ability of a prison locally to mitigate the suffering they cause is limited at best. And then there are consequential excesses, products of a system overburdened largely because of those reckless policies on sentencing and release. They include poor conditions, both in terms of physical surroundings and of regimes that are both literally and figuratively narcotic in their effect. Inadequate protection against the abuse of authority, complaint systems that don't work, and little or no access to legal assistance or protection during custody. Inadequate protection from harm during custody caused by violence from both prisoners and staff, poor physical and mental health care, and record levels of self-harm. Inadequate protection from premature death, both self-inflicted and otherwise. Poor access to loved ones, especially through geographical allocation driven by overcrowding, a form of aggravated exile. And a disproportionately bad experience if you were the wrong ethnicity, religion, or age. In other words, the gap between what we say we will inflict in the name of punishment and the suffering we actually administer now amounts to systemic hypocrisy. The pain inflicted exceeds what can be delivered with humanity. So what does this mean for staff, both leaders and the teams that they lead? Well, from time to time, excessive punishment will take such dramatic form that it translates directly into permanent damage to the relationships on which safe and decent prisons depend. For example, when the government changed allocation criteria in a way that effectively denied life sentence prisoners access to open prisons in the summer of 2022, the task of explaining why the changes had been made fell to staff in prisons. Anyone with experience of prisons will know that both staff and prisoners place enormous value on telling it straight. But there was no straight explanation to give about a policy which overnight turned so much of the advice given to a life on how to make progress into a cruel confidence trick. Another cardinal virtue in prisons is not to promise anything you can't deliver. In every discussion group over the last few months, prisoners have told me it's better to be told the truth from the start than to have hopes raised, then dashed. The appalling history of the IPP sentence offends against this principle on both an individual and a strategic level. It has led not only to the destruction of trust, but to multiple suicides and the disintegration of individuals' mental health. It's prison officers, nurses, psychologists, and probation officers who pick up the pieces of a policy that lost all appreciation of its excessively punitive effect. Now, it would be wrong to give the impression that either governors or officers spend their days agonising about the moral hazard in their work and how to cope with it. Most of what I've described as excessive punishment all too easily becomes an undesirable normality. But the gap between aspiration and reality is widening, and everyone has to deal with it one way or another. Here are some of the approaches I've witnessed. Ignore the issue. Hear no evil and see no evil. Double down and sign up to the idea that the harsher the punishment, the better the interests of past and future victims are served. Cling to the idea that you are simply an agent of a legal system which allegedly remains the envy of the world. Play the subversive, fight the system from within. Be the reluctant servant. If I wasn't doing this, somebody more dangerous would be. And finally, and still perhaps most commonly, be the person who tries to do good within the system. Though it's important to acknowledge that within this category, there are multiple types of carer, some better suited to the work than others, and all perfectly catalogued in Dr. Sarah Tate's study of prison officers in the first decade of this century. I found in my conversations with prisoners that they recognised all of these approaches in both staff and managers. They were surprisingly generous in their assessment of how far the deterioration in their quality of life was down to factors which no one locally could control. But they were also clear about ways in which the loss of legitimacy caused by excessive punishment could be mitigated. First, recognition of shared humanity was described in different terms as the first characteristic of a good prison officer. Distressingly, the phrase, "I just want to be treated like a human being," was used in virtually every discussion. Officers who had the personality and attitude to form authentic relationships with prisoners were easily identified and highly valued. Second, prisoners seemed to me to value an honest conversation about how to create a sense of purpose day to day in prison. This couldn't be all about rehabilitation or restoration or redemption. They knew the system could not be relied upon either to create or deliver a coherent plan for their time in custody in the sense of preparing for a future outside prison. But good staff and good leaders could help to provide meaning in the here and now, both through attention to them as individuals and through attention to the way the prison community operated. And third, in a bleak context, prisoners also valued the opportunities to contribute to the well-being of that community. I found them frustrated by the unwillingness of prisoners to trust them and make good use of their goodwill, skills, and knowledge to improve things. In short, I heard prisoners endorsing the relational approach to working in prisons that has been a distinguishing feature of all the best prisons that I have visited or worked in. Personal legitimacy appeared to be able to survive in the face of systemic illegitimacy. Good local practice could, at least to some degree, insulate both prisoners and staff from the consequences of political and strategic failure. But perhaps I've just been hearing what I wanted to hear. because that relational model is under acute strain and may be at risk of irreversible damage. There is nothing inevitable about its survival. For good leaders and good staff, for whom personal integrity and authenticity are indispensable, the gap between what they consider humane and what they are able to deliver cannot expand indefinitely. Prisoners noticed that the best staff were sometimes the ones who left, disillusioned by what they were required to defend. So while it is crucial that the prison service commits afresh to a relational model and transforms the training and appraisal of all its staff in support of that objective, a recalibration of the punishment the service is required to deliver is also essential. Our national appetite for retribution has become immoderate and led us to tolerate suffering, both deliberate and consequential, that undermines the moral justification for what we ask our prison service to do. It has created an underlying hypocrisy in expecting people to deliver an inhumane retribution in a humane way. We should not expect either to recruit or retain the workforce the service needs, if that remains the case.
So I think Peter selected me not because of my depth of academic knowledge, because of my quick thinking and my analytical brain, but because I represent the people he's talking about and the people he was once a member of. Peter's been a loss, actually, and looking around the room, there are a number of former colleagues and some smaller number of current colleagues in here. And that interesting point that Peter made about those people who struggle most, finding it difficult to carry on and being the ones who leave, perhaps holds true. I wanted to be able to disagree with Peter. We talked about being slightly combative, and I find myself absolutely unable to do that. What Peter has said, what he's represented in his presentation to you all is accurate. It is where we are now. And thinking of those various categorizations of those in our prisons and how they justify their continued participation in that system, when that is said so openly and clearly and thoughtfully, causes me to think about what I'm doing, genuinely. It's also fair to say that line that was described earlier today about the line between punishment and the seriousness of the transgression, the offence, has ceased to hold any real meaning for me. The IPP sentence is the prime example of that, but there are others. The average length of a life sentence for somebody convicted of murder having almost doubled during the course of the 30 years that I've been in prison is other evidence of that. And that tariff on a life sentence, that length of time that's the minimum somebody should serve in prison, is about society's wish for retribution. That is the punishment bit of the sentence. And why has that doubled? Why does this society, this country, require people to serve twice as long as they did 30 years ago in order to feel like they have their pound of flesh? One of the other things that's come out of today for me, the whole of today, but Peter's input particularly, is how little people in my position think about what they're doing and why. It isn't part of our normal day-to-day work that we are sitting around considering what it is we're doing and what we're doing it for. And that's a bit of a sad statement to make. But I think the reason for that is probably because there are a growing proportion of prison governors and prison staff and others working in and around criminal justice who can see what's happened over the past 20 or 30 years, and are not comfortable with it. And the more they think about it, and the less powerful they feel to do something, to make some change, to have some agency, to make it different, that leads to pain, you know, for those individuals, for people working in prison. I think lots of people are struggling with that at the minute. Relationships are absolutely at the centre of working in prisons. They always have been. Without positive relationships, without there being some sort of psychological contract between people in prison and the people working in prisons, there aren't enough people working in prisons to make prison safe, to make prison work. So there has to be consent. It has to feel reasonable. And the extent to which that contract is being broken is increasing. So early on in my career, I enjoyed when confronted by a prisoner with a grievance or a problem, being able to explain to them why things were the way they were. I felt comfortable more often than not with that explanation. They didn't always agree with me, sometimes they did, but I felt able to explain why we were doing what we were doing. That explanation's become more difficult over time. Providing those explanations isn't as easy as it once was. And in some cases, it's impossible. In the case of some of the regimes that we're currently delivering, in the case of some of the sentences that men in custody are serving, I cannot rationally explain to them why that serves a purpose. And that's a really uncomfortable place to be. So I think about where I'm fit. Am I just burying my head in the sand? Am I ignoring it? Certainly haven't doubled down on the concept of thinking this is the way to go. Absolutely not. Do I think I'm doing good from within? Well, to some extent. I think that's what keeps the majority of people going. Because everybody I've come across who works in criminal justice anywhere is not in this for the money. And they're not in it for some sort of perverse sense of power or something else. They're in it because they think they are doing good things. It's just becoming more difficult to think that. It's not until you listen to people talk about suffering and punishment in a way we have today that you actively consider it. I don't often actively consider it. What I do consider day to day is the relationships that I have with people in custody and the people that I work with, and making those relationships valuable, not just to me, but valuable to them, having relationships where I know people and I know what motivates them and I know what they're going through, or try to understand what they're going through. I have some insight. I think that's important. I think that's what keeps people going, serving long sentences, that somebody understands. The other thing I'd say with some of those really, really long sentences, that there is a temptation to think that people in prison are all motivated by the idea that they'll make progress through their sentence, they'll change, and they'll get out, and they'll live a better life outside prison. There is a growing number of people who have given up on the idea of getting out of prison. It's not something they want, and it's not something that motivates them. And that's because everything that you and I have in our life that keeps us going, that grounds us, our friends, our family, purpose, doesn't exist for people outside prison. It's gone. And everything they've got that gives them purpose and value is inside now. That's the saddest thing. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sending Peter back to Grant because I think it may be easier to hear him when he's using that mic. So again, if you have a question, could you please say who you are when I call upon you. So who would like to go? Paula, John, and then Jason.
You said that you didn't, to both of you, you said that you hadn't really thought about the moral conundrums involved when you first signed up to do the job, and then it's come later, this sort of recognition. Do you think we should like explore that more deeply with new recruits so that they have some sort of ability to because I think the moral blindness essentially plays out for prisoners, and it has direct impact on prisoners. So for me, I'd say it's a really critical point to explore in recruitment.
I mean, short answer is yes. I mean, I think we're unambitious in how we expect everybody who comes to work in prisons to think before they do it. It's not just governors. I told benefit about this. Actually, I listened to your inaugural professorial lecture and told you should give it to new entry prison officers, and you said, yes, I'd need to adapt it. And I don't think you do need to adapt it. I think we should be much more direct with people about the moral dilemmas that they're going into, because you're right. I think it does feed through into people's behaviour. I remember, I used to do all these things by just telling old stories, relapsing into telling old stories. But I remember in a prison being in the segregation unit and hearing a young prison officer, not a bad prison officer, but a young prison officer, talk in a way that was not appropriate to an older man in the segregation unit. He'd said to him, you're behaving like a child. And I just thought, you can't talk to an older person in that way. There is a moral element to the way that you address people, regardless of your position in the sort of power spectrum. And that's the way to translate it. I think for people who are going into the job, say there are things that you will be required to do every day, over and over again, which you can do in more than one way. And how you choose to do them will go straight back to principles, moral principles that you have. The Sarah Tate work that I mentioned, it makes it sound like I'm familiar with all the work. This is Kimit Edgar, who's not here, but Kimit regularly sends me things that I should read. It is a brilliant analysis of different ways in which you can care, and how some forms of caring actually can be quite corrosive. And we should be making all prison officers read that before they start, and all governors read it before they start, because it's kind of easy to understand. It's not academic in the sense of words that nobody uses. It's easy to understand.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, John Greening from Anglia Ruskin. I am also a former colleague, prison officer for 16 years. I got out about 3 years ago. Now an academic, or trying to be an academic. But I just wanted to say, you say about some people leaving, whether they said, they're leaving because they're the good staff that are leaving. I'm leaving because of, I wanted to make a change to help the prison officers that are really struggling, because prison officers are suffering alongside prisoners as well, as you know. I'll give an example. When we had the draconian cuts, and then spies came in all through this sort of 2011, 2012, 2013. A very good friend of mine, married, a couple of kids, got assaulted several times, said goodbye to his wife one morning, went up to the top of a hill, poured petrol on himself in his car, and he's ended his life. One of the reasons I've got out is because I want to make a change and help prisoners and help staff as well, because everybody's suffering in there. If you look at the statistics at the moment, from about 2016, we always look at all the stats that you keep showing all the time. We had approximately over 60-something% staff with over 10 years experience at band 3 to 5. So they're the officers that are on the front line. And now we're looking at the early 20%. So we're about 23% of staff in the whole of the prison service with over 10 years experience. And if we look at all the research from everyone, especially in Cambridge, that will say that how important it is that we've got experience, and that is dwindling. And also we look at the numbers of prisoners that we're now looking at, probably 110,000 by 2027. So we've got this drastic line of experienced staff dwindling down to probably about 15%, I'm predicting, by 2027. and 110,000 prisoners, and we probably all here will agree.
To turn this into a question.
Yeah, the question for me is, I've never seen this so bad. It's getting worse. Where can we see hope? Where do you see hope as a former governor and as the, of where we can turn things around here?
Well, there isn't much of it, but the one thing I would say is not to challenge that assessment, but just a health warning about the experience question. So Alison will tell me this is wrong, but there is a point where experience isn't necessarily a good thing. There's a kind of a sweet spot. But the other thing was that listening to prisoners talk about officers, they often said exactly that. They said, "Oh, we like the old school. We knew where we stood. We really missed the experience." If you then said, "Well, tell me about the best prison officer on your landing, the best prison officer in this prison," inevitably, they describe people who've been in it for 6 months as well as people who've been in it for 10 years. And they described attitudes and they described humanity and empathy more than they described experience. So, and the echo of that was some of the governors that I had conversations with as I was going around were saying, "We're getting fantastic people through the gate. I'm really excited by what I can do with this new workforce." The cloud on the horizon, of course, is that you can't do that if you are delivering a regime which is inadequate, if you're delivering something that you're ashamed of, if you're actually spending your life accounting for what you've done rather than trying to change what you're doing. So I think there is reason for optimism in that the work, despite being work that requires you to make people suffer, does still attract some exceptional people to do it at all levels. We just have to provide an environment where those people can prosper and do something that meets the ambition they had when they started.
Thank you, Peter. We'll have to be quick. So Jason, you'll have to be quick. That means.
Okay, and this is kind of to both these, but you both pointed out that there is this kind of disjunct between kind of policy and practice, which is therefore increasing the suffering that people are experiencing, which is then increasing the moral hazard the officers and staff are facing. What do you think that that increased moral hazard, the effect that is having on staff cultures rather than their kind of practice?
Well, Tom's more up to date than me, so I'll be quick and then he should say something. I think it's really dangerous. So I think there are quite a lot of people coming who just have no background in what we're talking about at all. They would be flummoxed by what people have been talking about this afternoon. And they're coming into a workforce which, 50% of the workforce has never seen a prison operating in the way that we think about, because they came in during the pandemic, and since the pandemic, actually, it's carried on pretty similarly. So they have no frame of reference at all. So actually a very distant, with nothing, don't establish relationships is quite familiar to a lot of people now, which is why I think the prison service corporately really has to commit to the relational model and not take it for granted. And I think it has been able to take it for granted because its leaders and its employees grew up with it, and they're a dwindling force now.
I think the only thing I would add to what Peter says is the pandemic period, everybody said that relationships are so important in prison. The ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to understand what might be behind the behaviour, because that's not always clear. To have some sort of frame of reference so you can understand behaviour and start to try and think about helping someone to change it if need be, has been massively damaged by the pandemic, but is also those skills, those abilities are also damaged by the way in which people interact generally now. So I work with staff who have not been used to having conversations with somebody who is not just like them, because they have been in contact with lots of their social interactions via social media, where they are seeking out people who are a bit like them, and finding staff who are just capable to talk to people as human beings with motivations and backstories and all of those kind of things, and understand that is more difficult. They are learning that at work rather than being well versed in that and bringing all that with them. Some people learn it really quickly and are really good at it, but they're having to learn it at work in lots of cases rather than bringing a wealth of knowledge and experience with them.
Thank you very much. Thank you for an excellent discussion.
Nineteen 62 or something. Yeah. Places changed. It's gone downhill.
Introduce this session. You all know Professor Ben Crew, and we're very much looking forward to what he's going to talk about. Do we punish too much? Punitive excess and the life sentence. And then his respondent is Bill Wheatley, who's the former Director General of the Prison Service and still acts as an expert in various ways, is very in touch. The detectives amongst you can work out whether he and the previous respondent are related and in what way. I'm sure it'll be a fabulous session. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm in the punishment practice part of the session rather than the punishment theory. So I'm going to talk about life sentence prisoners. There are currently 7,346 people in custody serving life sentences. That's double the number from 1993 and almost 2,000 more than 20 years ago during a period when the homicide rate has fallen. More specifically, in recent years, there have been significant increases in the number of people serving very long sentences. So there are now over 2,700 people in tariffs of over 20 years, compared to 888 in 2011. Also increases in the average tariff. Tom just mentioned that. So the tariff is the minimum term you will serve. This is for mandatory life sentences. So 12.5 years, I rounded up to 13 in 2003, rising to around 21 years since 2016. So here you can see how that growth developed. And this is mainly due to changes in legislation rather than the sort of gravity of murders. And third, increase in the amount of time actually served in custody, both for mandatory and discretionary lifers, as we see here. So I want to talk about the consequences of these changes. And if we take the systemic consequences first, I think the three primary issues relate to the prison population, second, order and control, and third, the risks of extremism. So official analysis confirms that the astonishing rise in the prison population since 1993 is largely a result of harsher sentencing, including increases in sentence lengths, time served, and licence periods, which leads to a greater number of people being recalled. And prisoners serving life sentences contribute significantly to that growth. It means they're clogging up the system with a substantial and fairly static rump, constituting 10% of all sentenced prisoners, including 853 who have been recalled. Second, there are implications for order and control. In our research, Susan Hulley, Serena Wright, and I found that prisoners in the early stage of long life sentences were overwhelmed by feelings of hopelessness. The future felt irrelevant or psychologically impossible to contemplate, and the present felt meaningless. Many were facing sentences longer than the number of years they'd been alive. So to quote Kenny, 18 years, at that age, I thought to myself, I haven't even lived 18 years. I'm never getting out of jail. So most said that they lived their sentence day by day, that they were stuck in a perpetual present with no sense of purpose or control. Here, Ashley says, a life sentence kills your hope. You've got no hope and no future, no life, no nothing. But alongside these feelings of existential helplessness, the most prominent emotion was anger. And often this anger was very diffuse or unfocused. So Assad said he was angry with me. I was angry with how my life turned out. Jeff, in this second quote, expresses his anger at being given such a long sentence at such a young age. And Ignacio here just described himself as constantly angry, just at everything. And we can see in the highlighted text here that the main manifestation of this anger was violence. This was violence against the authorities or violence against other prisoners. Sentence lengths of this magnitude also generate non-compliance and dangerous feelings of nihilism. So many prisoners in our study felt they just had nothing to lose in getting involved in the drugs trade, or if you look at the second quote, in just kind of causing havoc. So Andre here says, I have nothing to lose at all. When I think about my sentence, that's when I just come up and do something mad. And other interviewees described disengaging or retreating into forms of moral darkness. So Victor says, I was in that stage when nothing mattered. I was going back to my little dark world. I didn't care. And here I'm just including a quote from a prison officer who I spoke to recently, who was working with in a young offenders institution and said, I'm petrified of the lifers on my wing. They're so young and so new to prison as a long-term reality, and this makes them the hardest to reach and rationalise with. They're feared to be the likeliest to be staff assaulters, and giving the simplest of instructions, such as please return to your cell, is often met with no, and what difference does a nicking or a write-up make to me? A further systemic consequence relates to ideological extremism. So for prisoners confronted with the existential void of so many years of imprisonment and the need to survive the conditions of high security imprisonment, faith practices and identities often provide safety, recognition, and self-understanding. So Ashley here describes the appeal of being part of something, a kind of form of fraternity. And Mohammed in the second quote he compares the care that he received from other Muslim prisoners to the normal dog-eat-dog world of the prison. And here in this third quote, Arshad explains how turning to Islam helped him get answers and find peace. And in circumstances where people are yearning for human comfort and explanation, these functions can be really beneficial. But as Alison and Ryan Williams have demonstrated, when prisoners feel dehumanized and discriminated against, they're more likely to develop ideologies, not just linked to Islam, of course, that are narrow, rigid, and politicized. And I think it's easy to see why angry and bewildered men, particularly young men, deprived of core human needs, can be drawn to radical or oppositional ideologies. So I think here what we're seeing are the systemic and operational consequences of sentences whose lengths feel existentially intolerable or deeply illegitimate. And people convicted under joint enterprise as secondary parties are particularly embittered. That group comprised 2/5 of our sample, 4/5 of whom did not consider themselves guilty of murder. They generally said, they felt that being sentenced to decades in prison was gratuitous and disproportionate. But we also need to care about the non-instrumental consequences of life imprisonment. So just this question of what are we doing to people when we commit them to prison for such a long time? So I've already said a bit about this, but I think to make normative evaluations about the limit points of punishment, this warrants more detail. Life imprisonment entails 3 major ruptures. These relate to separation from loved ones and other social relationships. Secondly, the reconsideration of moral selfhood. So who am I if I am capable of this? And third, the need to abandon any existing conception of one's future. And we found that many of the hardest parts of long-term incarceration reflected these issues: missing people, worrying about people outside, losing the best years of your life, and thinking about your index offence. It's important to point out that these are not about direct institutional treatment, so much as issues that are existential or external to the prison. That tells us something important, that life imprisonment, regardless of how decent or humane an institution might be, generates forms of suffering that are profound and very difficult to mitigate. I want to touch on these briefly. So first, and perhaps obviously, with regards to loved ones outside, those in our sample who had children said that the fracturing of the parental relationship was acutely painful. So Gail said, the hardest thing for me when I came into jail was nobody told me how not to be a mum. One participant described to me a recurring nightmare in which, beyond a wall too high to scale, he could hear his young child crying. And other people used the language of bereavement. So Catherine said, every time I see my daughter, it brings up all my feelings for her again. And then I spend the next 4 months grieving. You're breaking your heart a little bit more every time. Those without children tended to report fears that their parents would not live to see them released. Many felt responsible for their parents' distress or physical and psychological deterioration. And I just want to read the bottom quote more or less in full. So Arshad said, the thought of taking my life came through my head. That was when the first visit came and I saw my mum and everyone. I've never seen my dad cry, but he was broken. I see my missus crying her eyes out. She was giving birth soon. And I thought, I'll never see my little girl. I'm never going to be able to take you out. All this stuff that a father wants to. I remember going back to my cell and sitting there thinking, would it be easier if I died? And alongside these feelings, many participants described the difficulty of coming to terms, not just with the sentence, but with the offence itself. I often wonder whether public perceptions are shaped very much by reports of court cases that characterise homicide defendants as callous or defiant. And certainly some of our interviewees said that they had shouted abuse at the judge, or they had laughed or eyeballed their victim's family. But these reactions were shaped at least as much by anger and shock and the need to put on a front of invulnerability at that point in time as by heartlessness. And in fact, almost all the participants in our study expressed remorse and regret at their involvement in someone else's death, generally saying it was much harder to reconcile themselves with what they had done than the situation they were in. And as we see in these quotes, many questioned their own humanity or were tormented by the knowledge of what they had done. So Leonard reflected, you'll never come to terms with it because it's an inhuman act. You lose something human inside of you once you commit a murder. Arkin said, you have to contemplate day in and day out what you've done, hoping that you're forgiven. And here Garrett just said, I'm deeply ashamed of what I've done. I hate myself for it. So if the appetite for harsh sentencing is based on assumptions about irredeemable wickedness, then that basis is a misapprehension. In our sample, among the men who were at the mid or late stage of their sentence, thinking about the crime you committed was the sixth most severely felt problem reported in our survey. And life is at this sentence stage, which was a kind of endless dead zone before release was even worth contemplating, described what we have called sedative coping. What that means is to get through, they had to engage in a form of psychological anesthesia, sort of numbing their emotions and suppressing the painful realities of their situation. So Israel says, my biggest fear is losing a close family member. I try to block those things out. Mason said, prisoners made me emotionless. It's like a dark hole. I can't grieve about anything. I just don't feel it. So I think it should be clear that what's being described here is not just the unpleasantness that Leo described some theorists say is inherent to punishment. It's not just Leo's less bloodless concept of suffering. It's something much more acute. It's, to quote Leo from earlier, it's the stuff of nightmares. These are forms of suffering that are much more acute, painful, and of course much longer in duration than anything that I think is defensible. So I think, or at least to subject people to such experiences requires very strong justification. So let me finish quickly with that consideration. If the rationale is general deterrence, I'm very sceptical. I'm very sceptical that longer tariffs have any impact on the decisions of people embedded in the urban drug economy or fast-moving, emotionally volatile situations. And deterrence scholars have concluded that there is little evidence that increasing already long prison sentences has a material deterrent effect. If the rationale is rehabilitation or specific deterrence, again, I'm sceptical. The evidence that longer homicide sentences decrease recidivism is certainly inconclusive. And our participants were, although they were relatively positive about therapeutic interventions, their reflections on their offence were largely independent of sort of fairly standard offending behaviour programmes. Fairly consistently, our participants acknowledged that they deserved a serious sanction, but felt that beyond a certain time point, their continued imprisonment was excessive and counterproductive. So Curtis says, I deserve to be punished for it, basically, so I deserve to be here, but I don't feel I deserve 19 years. I don't think that amount of time is good for anybody, really. If you can't rehabilitate someone after 10 years, there's no hope for them. And Kenny said similar things. It gets to the point where you think this is too long. Now, having served 10 years, I'm at a good stage where I could get out and I know I could do well and I could stay out, but in 7 years' time, I don't know. And certainly our post-release interview suggested that the emotional suppression required to survive the sentence was socially disabling in the community, as we see here. So I think the primary rationale is retribution and public protection, and long sentences are quite good at both of those things. But retribution is not a helpful organising principle for prisons, and it comes at huge human and financial cost. I think that at their current length, life sentences are wasteful in the true sense of that term, in that they expend something of value carelessly, extravagantly, and with insufficient purpose. Mohammed says, don't say we're putting you in jail to rehabilitate you, because 30 years to life don't go with the word rehabilitation, because that's no hope. Everything that you know you're taken away from. And it just felt harsh, because at the end of the day, I was a kid. So to finish, work by the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies suggests that reducing all sentences by 20% would have a significant impact on the prison population, much more so than reforming short sentences. But the length of our life sentences exceeds most comparable countries and historical precedent, to a point where we've become really blasé about sentence lengths that used to be considered unsurvivable. So at minimum, I would urge 4 things. First, the resentencing of people convicted as secondary parties under joint enterprise. Second, the introduction of a distinction between first and second degree murder, with only the former carrying the mandatory life sentence. Third, improved support for lifers pre and post release to reduce the prevalence of recall. And finally, a return to the tariff points that were in place prior to the early 2000s. That still leaves the option of keeping people in custody if you think, or if they are thought to be a serious risk to life and limb. So it doesn't have to compromise public safety, but it allows the release at an earlier stage than present of people who do not represent that risk. It would also, I think, increase legitimacy and provide a vital source of hope and motivation. Thank you.
It's difficult to respond to that without being acutely conscious of the pain that is being caused actually in the pursuit of political advantage, because we should look at why sentences have become so long. I'm old enough to remember the day in 1983 when Leon Britton, because he was under pressure, prisons were bursting again, decided to increase the amount of remission that short sentence prisoners got. But in order to make that palatable to the Conservative Party conference he was addressing, he said he was going to make it much more difficult for long sentence prisoners to get parole, and made a virtue of that, and that he was going to set new tariffs for life imprisonment, particularly for those who had used guns, knives, and shot policemen, etc., which we had a number, all of whom had at that point a fixed sentence. The longest tariff, I think, was 30 years at the time. That's now commonplace. We had lifers who got a tariff of 15 years. We and they thought that was pretty long. Suddenly they found they were a new category, now had a tariff of 25 years, because that kept the Conservative Party conference sweet as they let other prisoners out early. And that process of politically driving up sentence lengths has continued, particularly in the post-Bolger era, as there was a sort of moral panic when the two they were only children,
killed a child in Liverpool, nothing to do with life sentences and thinking about retribution and what was the right tariff or anything like that. Simply two children behaving in a bizarre way. But we met that with the moral panic and the political response, which Tony Blair rode beautifully as he did tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, and they encouraged longer sentences, which in his government, Mr. Plunkett in particular, was a leading light in this, were enacted. So we had a series of compulsory political tariffs, and that has continued with the present government over its 14 years, having had several bouts of that. So it is a driving up the sentence lengths that has made imprisonment cruel and inhumane for many of our most long sentence prisoners, like us in particular, and Ben's exposed that beautifully. Everything that Ben says makes sense to me as somebody who still goes around prison and certainly spends a lot of time talking to people who are involved in the world of prison. The question, I think, is what do we do about it? Because we will worthily agree this isn't right, but somehow we're going to find a way of getting that onto the political agenda, hopefully as politics change after an election, in which it might be possible to have a more rational discussion about how do you use the available prison spaces, which we've rapidly run out of. We are now absolutely at bust, so we have to reduce something, and it will be a travesty if what happens is we let short sentence prisoners out even earlier, but then keep the longer sentence prisoners even longer in order to make that politically palatable. So all of us, anybody who thinks they've got any influence in this, needs to make that very difficult for politicians, because if we don't speak up, if we don't use the research, if the researchers don't use the research and make sure it hits widely, not just an audience of people who are very interested, we will fail to halt what is a slide into a cruel and inhumane society, mistreating its criminals in a way we never used to. And I just throw in one other thought. I'm struck as I think about this, that as I joined the service, lots of people knew prisoners, ex-prisoners, because they knew lots of prisoners of war, who knew exactly what it was like to do indeterminate sentences. And there was a consciousness of how difficult imprisonment was to do, because so many people had been involved in being in prison as a result of being captured during the war. That kept that view alive, that it wasn't something you did casually. They, of course, no longer exist. They've all died, and we've forgotten that lesson. We need just to remind ourselves that imprisonment can be very cruel just by sheer length, let alone the impoverished regimes that we're running at the moment, with the staff who are no longer as capable as they were to engage with people and empathise and make imprisonment feel at least a little less tough and hard to do. Thanks.
Can I tie this back to the last session? If you're a prison governor or prison officer dealing with lifers, and you try to explain to them what's going on and why, is there room to say within your understanding of your job, look, this is unreasonable, unjust, absurd, but we have to deal with it? Or is your job to try somehow to make sense of it being justified? And how far is there room for prison officers to resist and help prisoners understand in a critical way what's going on?
I feel like I should defer to Tom. Where's Tom Wheatley gone? He was governing Wakefield Prison.
So I think what your job is to do anything to make it more bearable. And if saying that this is unreasonable, the way you are being treated is unreasonable, and I can't justify that to you, would help you to deal with the situation you're in, and that's probably what I'd do. But if that was going to make that more difficult, I probably wouldn't. Because what I'm actually trying to do is to make sure that the sentence is survivable.
I feel like Anthony and I are sort of like the two gentlemen in the Muppets. You went so far, I think. I was struck Richard, you said, the challenge is how do we get it back on the political agenda? And I immediately thought, surely the best hope is to get it off the political agenda. And how do politicians who know that something has to be done but don't want to do it get away with things? They set up royal commissions. Because then they can say, this was what the experts recommended. Because in fairness to politicians, and I'm not prone to being fair to them, we do know that they will get, quote unquote, punished by the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph or the Sun if they take this on themselves. So I just wonder whether the best hope is if the incoming government would think, we don't want to touch this, we don't want to take the blame. So let's set up a royal commission and get out of this problem that way. Isn't that the most hopeful thing? Because
I think it probably is. I'm thinking of Ned Hardwick here, who's on a commission. I can't quite recall who has established it, but
I'm on the Times Criminal Justice Commission, and I would say which is a journal. I mean, it needs to be understood as a journalistic exercise, not a commission in the sort of statutory sense, I think. But in terms of the pressure on politicians, I don't think it comes from the mainstream media. It comes from social media. People are affecting it are people who read The Guardian and Sun or whatever, because hardly anybody does read those things from social media. But I think that you may just say, it does seem to me that where's the pressure to do something about this? I think it comes from two places. One is they need to do something about it next month, because they're going to run out of space next month, right? So this isn't, they haven't got time for a royal commission, which is a good thing, I think. And secondly, they haven't got the money to spend £4 billion building new prisons. And it's noteworthy, before I came, I was looking at the Labour Party manifesto, very striking that they say nothing in the manifesto about building an extra 20,000 prison places and spending all that money on it. And I think they've left, I don't think they've sort of forgotten to put that in, they've left it out deliberately. So they are going to have to do something because they can't afford to continue on this. Regardless of the morals of it, they haven't got the money. Right? And therefore the question then in terms of influence is what can we, what are the options that they could then follow to get themselves out of the hole they're in, when in fact they've got some political space to do it, because they can say, oh, well, we've looked under the bonnet, fancy that. It's much more of a mess than we thought, we're going to have to do something different. Or what are the different things that would be sensible that we think we can get them, that they might be amenable to do. And I tell you, my own experience I took with some of the Labourers and French people is they don't understand it. I had one quite eminent Labour politician say to me, oh, well, don't worry, we're going to fix the overcrowding crisis because we're going to sort out the courts back. So my point is they don't understand, but I think they have to do something. The time and financial pressures are at the moment something that causes the wind to blow in the direction of reform.
Can I suggest rather than an answer? We've got 3 questions lined up, so one here. Can we hear the questions? You might have 1 second to answer.
Sounds perfect.
Yeah, my question slightly been stolen actually.
That's the same thing.
Yeah, it's Mark Day from the Prison Reform Trust, and it was the answer. It was the question of what do we do. So particularly the example of how would you get the tariffs back to the 2003 situation? Somebody said take it out of politics. I don't think that's possible. That just isn't possible. So what you need to do is to create some kind of dialogue between the political side and the policy side, and have some kind of sort of independent way of making recommendations that would reduce that length. So yeah, it's an open question. How do we get there? Is there anything we could do in terms of government and oversight that could sort of get us to that place?
So mine was, sorry, I'm Jason Moore, Nottingham University. There are currently around 5,000 lifers who are in the community. who have, you know, post-release, who are living in the community. And we know that a number of those people are either in economic precarity or outright poverty. So I want to know, I just wanted to ask how you think the kind of extension of the life sentence into the life course beyond prison acts as an excessive punishment.
Yeah. Hi, yeah, Dan, Westminster University, what I last time. I just wanted to ask, is there a precedent? Has there ever been a reduction in the length of sentences and or tariffs ever in our history? And I feel like that would answer a lot of questions, but it solves the answer to that, yeah?
Okay.
Okay, you got one.
Okay. So Dan, I don't know, but Nick might know. What I do know is
Abolition of the death penalty.
yeah. In some ways, the impact of that was a huge increase in the size of the lifeboat population. The other thing I'm going to say is, I mean, I'm saying something maybe self-evident, but it's so much easier to ratchet things up and down. And actually, I should defer to Susie Holly here, but the recent suggestion that the tariff for domestic homicide that should go up, because then that brings it in line with murders with a bladed weapon outside the home is another example of that where you know we just end up pulling everything up to higher tariffs.
Yeah, I'm aware. I just meant here.
We had it. We didn't. We prevented it. We got rid of a very, very long sentence in the 50s, which was called preventative detention, or the early 60s. It was abolished. It's a bit like an extended sentence, and became a scandal. Like IPPs have become a scandal, but MPs at that point felt able to step back from it. I think it's much more politically difficult to do now than it was. Though with a giant majority, there might just be a chance. So there'll be a window of opportunity if the government comes in with an enormous majority to do unpopular things quickly, not slowly, because the majority will act.
No, you're talking about, didn't that just change to the detained sentence?
Sorry?
That, when that was abolished, it was replaced by the detained sentence.
No, it wasn't. It was they returned to, if you sell milk bottles, which is what they used to give it for, the minor thefts, if you do a lot of them, you've got a very, very long sentence. And they moved back from that and genuinely changed it.
Okay. Last word.
Difficult to do this very quickly. In our study, we have interviewed lifers released into the community because it's a longitudinal study. And I think they split actually into those that seem to be doing quite well, mainly because they've got jobs through people they knew before they came in, not so much because of what the sentence or the system has done for them, and those who are hopeless and in despair. And then, of course, lots in our sample have been recalled to prison. So we ended up, you know, out of our group that had been released, I think about a third of our interviews with them ended up being once they'd come back into the system. So certainly highly precarious.
All right, so welcome to our next lecture. And then we'll have a commentary by Professor Andrew. So,
great, thank you. And thank you very much to Leo and to Alison for the invitation and to Anthony for agreeing to comment. When I first got the invitation, my reaction was very much like Nicky Padfield's. I just thought, do we punish too much? Well, yes, of course we punish too much. And then as I sat down to think about what I was actually going to say, it got more and more tricky, I thought. And I'm afraid as a result, I'm going to be sort of terribly graceless, having accepted an invitation to talk on a topic from such a wonderful group of people and say that it's not really the right question. And the reason it's not really the right question is that it doesn't have an unambiguous answer, at least with respect to any of the main purposes of punishment. So that the way in which the talk is structured is just to look at each, well, not all of them, but the main purposes of punishment, and then ask the question with respect to each. Do we punish too much with respect to whatever that purpose is? So let's think about deterrence. Do we punish too much with respect to deterrence? So the answer is yes. Both generally, our overall rates and quantities of punishment don't deliver efficient marginal deterrence, and also in specific cases, as we've just seen from Ben, pushing up the average tariff for murder from the low teens to the low 20s is not justified by deterrence considerations. However, once one thinks about specific offences and about the fact that the most important element of deterrence is the likelihood of being caught and convicted, not the size of the penalty, then the answer becomes more problematic. Do we prosecute, do we catch, prosecute and convict, and so deter enough of those who commit fraud, of those who break labour laws, including ensuring that they pay their workers the national minimum wage, and those who commit sexual offences, including rape? Probably not. The deterrence rate for people paying under the national minimum wage and ignoring labour laws is pretty close to zero, because we have almost no people going out and enforcing those laws. So deterrence is not, in some sense, of course, yes, it's true, we punish too much from the point of view of deterrence, but it's not unambiguously true. We don't punish sufficient fraudsters, we don't punish sufficient people who run, not far from here, poultry processing plants, and we don't punish sufficient section offenders, probably don't punish sufficient politicians to deter their behaviour. So, okay, so deterrence is ambiguous. What about incapacitation? Do we punish too much with respect to incapacitation? Now, I'm not actually sure how one would answer that question if it's just put like that. Clearly, we incapacitate people who do not, in fact, pose a continuing risk to others, false positives, and we do not incapacitate some people who do pose a risk, false negatives. And having just had coffee and cake with Tony Bottoms, I think Tony was pointing out that the role that risk and the parole board have played or are playing in our overall question is probably something we should pay more attention to, at least in the next seminar, if not in this one. But okay, so it's true that we incapacitate some people who don't need incapacitating. It's true that we don't incapacitate some people who probably do need incapacitating. But what does that tell us? We're not going to get an answer to the question, do we punish too much from the point of view of incapacitation? Because we don't have an answer to the question, how many false positives are acceptable? Is it acceptable to incapacitate 10 false positives in order to get one correct? If not 10, 5, if not 5, 2, not 2, 20. That question can't be answered just by asking the question, do we punish too much? So from the point of view of deterrence, it's ambiguous. From the point of view of incapacitation, I think it's probably pretty close to just the wrong question. We've got to think about where incapacitation fits in our criminal justice system, if it fits at all, and then questions about the overall justifiability of using it. Just asking, do we incapacitate too much, isn't going to get us that answer. Rehabilitation, well, it's a similar sort of problem. In a sense, it seems an odd thing to say, do we punish enough or too much from the point of view of rehabilitation? I mean, in one sense, clearly not. The people who we convict, who pay fines or spend time in prison, return to the community not rehabilitated. But that doesn't mean, and please don't take me to mean, that I think we should just keep punishing them more and more and more until they are rehabilitated, not least because it wouldn't work. But instead, we should just ask a different question, which is, are we punishing in the right way, rather than are we punishing too much or too little? I don't know, in some strict sense, whether we're punishing too much or too little from the point of view of rehabilitation, because too many other variables impact that question. The final one I'll look at before I'm going to suggest a reframing of the question is desert. Desert's the trickiest of all of these, I think. Do we punish too much from the point of view of desert? Now, you can ask that question in terms of relative proportionality. Do we punish this kind of offender too much relative to that kind of offender? And that you can get an answer to. But my concern is with cardinal proportionality or absolute proportionality. Do we punish too much from the point of view of desert? Leo, when we began today, was saying, this line is going to be too high. And I was thinking, well, I agree with you, but how do we know it's too high? And that's, of course, the problem with cardinal or absolute desert, which is trying to work out, what kind of celestial mechanics delivers a certain kind of judgment that this amount of suffering or this amount of punishment is equivalent to this offense. And since, I could and have written huge amounts on this, and time is short, I'm just going to illustrate the problem by way of an anecdote. Years ago, at the other university, I was at a workshop with many of the world's top philosophers of punishment, and me. A distinguished Finn, I'm not going to name these people, but you'll know who they are, presented a paper that included details of the Finnish sentencing guidelines. It was a paper about how Finland, to go to a question that was asked in the last session, Finland has successfully reduced tariffs quite significantly. And so the paper was about that, and also, as a sort of appendix, had examples from the sentencing guidelines of Finland. Now, I can't remember the exact offence that caused the discussion that followed, so I'm just going to say that the guidelines for offence O involved a sentencing range from S1 to S2. So the Finns presented this. A similarly distinguished American at the workshop objected. He said, no, that's wrong. This caused some confusion, not to say consternation. The Finns said, no, it's correct. And much puzzlement kind of followed until we worked out that America was not saying that it was incorrect as a matter of the description of the Finnish sentencing code. The American was saying it was the wrong number. It was too low. The sentence for offence O ought not to be S1 to S2, it ought to be S20 to S21. You had the world's top penal philosophers there, or Anglo-American ones, and me, and the conversation went absolutely nowhere. Because it's got one guy saying, look, it has to be 10 years minimum for that offence, and another guy going, and they were both guys, saying, well, actually, in Finland, it's 3 and it's all fine. And the first guy goes, no, it's not fine because they're not getting what they deserve. It has to be 10. Then at some point, and I do have this worry about absolute proportionality, I simply don't understand what kind of account one would have to generate an answer to that question. So do we punish too much from the point of view of desert? I actually think it's not only unanswerable. I mean, there are very sophisticated attempts to answer it. There are very sophisticated accounts of the way in which we might think about penal severity versus crime seriousness. But ultimately, there are ways of trying to unpack seems to me, an arbitrary connection, which is between an offence and a sentence. I happen to think it's actually also probably a dangerous question to ask, because I think once you introduce the language of desert, and once you allow that there are cardinal judgments to be had, you open up the space for what we've seen happen. And there's a very interesting review of Andrew von Hirsch's 1976 Doing Justice, often regarded as the book that kind of launched the retributive revival after indeterminate sentencing in the United States. And it's a very interesting review by an American in 1976 or 77, in which he's broadly sympathetic to the book and broadly sympathetic to the idea of proportionality replacing indeterminate sentences. But at the end of the review, or the beginning, I can't quite remember, he says something along the lines of, whilst I don't object to what's in this book, I worry enormously about the reintroduction of the language of desert into criminal justice. Because although the authors of this work are humane and sensible and hoping for reductions in overall sentencing level, others, more maliciously inclined, will leap on the language of desert and turn it to their own ends. And I think that happened, and I don't think it was Andrew von Hirsch's intention at all to launch what has become mass incarceration, quite the reverse. But once you unfetter the language of desert, and once you allow the thought that there is some number that is deserved and appropriately attached to some offence, I think it's at least tricky to stop that exploding in your face. And I think it has exploded in our faces. So with respect to deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and desert, I don't think it's straightforward, let me put it like that, to ask the question, do we punish too much? That's not to say that I don't think we do punish too much. It's just to say I don't think that question is going to get us to the nature of the problem. What we need, in a way, is to either to disaggregate the question, or possibly, I think, to reframe it. So, and I don't have these are very preliminary thoughts now in the final section. So one possibility, obviously, would be to say, look, it's one question we should ask, do we punish too much? But amongst many other things, do we punish the right things? Do we punish the right people? Do we punish in the right ways? And so on. So we could ask a whole series of questions, including the question, do we punish too much? But, you know, that doesn't give us a bumper sticker for the workshop. And since I've been gracious enough to say that I don't think the bumper sticker I was invited to talk about is the right one, let me see if I can offer an alternative. It's less punchy, but it's relatively short, which is, do we use the criminal justice system appropriately? Now, I don't think we do, but I think it's interesting to think about that question, and I haven't thought about it for very long because I only came up with it when I was drafting these notes. But do we use the criminal justice system appropriately? Now, I don't think we do, and as a result, we do punish too much. But asking the question in the form, do we use the criminal justice system appropriately, allows us to see, for example, what's wrong with our approach to drugs. What's wrong with our approach to drugs, it seems to me, is not best illuminated by saying, do we punish too much? Do we punish too many people who sell marijuana, do we punish them too much? But rather, what are we doing in the first place, using the criminal justice system as our response to drugs? Wouldn't we be much better off taking a public health approach to drugs? Similarly, when we fail to rehabilitate, it's not, and when we're thinking about rehabilitation, it's surely not because we punish too much or too little, but because we fail to think through where does rehabilitation fit in the appropriate use of the criminal justice system. So again, I think asking the question, are we using this particular kind of form of public policy intervention in the right kind of way, does throw light on the question, do we punish too much? But it also throws light on other questions where we might be equally suspicious that what we're doing is wrong. 2 minutes early. I'm between you and the one. Thank you.
I would thank Matt, but alas, he's made my life difficult because I find I agree with everything he says. I can't now say that here's about my Travis is wrong. I always enjoy saying I can't say it now. He's right. So what I'll add a few footnotes to what Travis said, to get clearer what follows from his comments. He's really right, first of all, the question, do we punish too much, requires a standard. Are our penal practices excessive or inefficient or ineffective in relation to this or that goal they should serve? When you go through the goals and ask for each goal, are we punishing appropriately? His own question, his bumper sticker, is more promising, I think. Do we use the criminal justice system appropriately? There are two benefits to this. First of all, it allows us to ask not just too much, but also too little, as Matt pointed out. We know not just do we punish too many, but are those we don't punish we should punish. It also has us looking at the system as a whole, not just punishment, but the whole system, which punishment is the culmination, if you like. And in both those ways, I think a better question for the apologists those who posed the first question. And I'll say a bit more now about the more particular questions that we might draw from that large general question and see where they take us. First of all, punishment presupposes criminalisation. If we punish too much, that could be because we've criminalised too much. We've criminalised too many kinds of behaviour that shouldn't be criminal. We define offences too broadly. That's one possible source of any punishment. So we need to look at our criminal law in the first place. What do we criminalise, and do we criminalise too much, or something too little? Are the things we should criminalise and don't criminalise? punishment presupposes not just formal criminal law, but also the law in action. It presupposes that the police and prosecutors and other officials actually arrest and prosecute people. We ask again, do the police and other officials, are they too quick to use the criminal law as a response to formally criminal behaviour? Are they too quick to arrest, prosecute, rather than some other kind of disposal? Maybe they are, very often they are. But also, are they sometimes too slow? Are they sometimes too slow to prosecute, to arrest? We need to ask, because again, this is another source of over or under punishment, the way in which we apply the criminal law, and we either think we use it too quickly or not quickly enough. Punishment presupposes the criminal trial. We punish those who've been convicted. So as our procedures, our criminal procedures, such that they make it too easy to punish, to convict the innocent over punishment, or too hard to convict the guilty under punishment. And finally, it's the punishment itself. Do we punish too many people who've been convicted? Should we find other disposals for many of them? Or do we punish those who do punish too harshly in over-harsh ways? And here we need to look in particular at different modes of punishment. Because it's easy, I can notice it today, I say, especially in talking to Americans actually, talk about over-punishment and talk about imprisonment as punishment, as if all punishment consisted is imprisonment. But what it doesn't, there are many modes of punishment. There are fines, probation, community service, and prison, and so on. So we need to ask not just do we punish too much, but do we punish in appropriate ways? And of course, what we say where appropriate or inappropriate might be that it's unduly harsh or oppressive or destructive. So we need to ask more carefully, do we punish in the wrong ways, not just do we punish too much or too little? But again, of course, we need to ask what standard are we judging, whether it's too much or too little. Are we talking about common humanity, which I think many kinds of prison completely with just common humanity? It's inhumane to impose this kind of suffering on people. But think about other kinds of punishment too, probation, community service, and so on. What makes them appropriate or inappropriate? By what standard do we judge whether they're appropriate, successful, or unsuccessful? I've used my 5 minutes, I think, just about. I'll also use my 2 minutes if you didn't use. I'm not going to offer answers, of course not. But I'm going to say, we start with the bumper question, whether it's do we punish too much or do we use the system appropriately? And that's a good bumper stick to start with. By the way, ask all these particular questions. And then we'll be interested in the end, right? Punishment. Whether we do it too much, it's all in the right ways. We have to go back to the first stages. Do we criminalize too much? Do we apply the law appropriately? Our criminal process, all these ways of getting towards punishment be excessive or inadequate. So we can't justify punishment, let's say justify prisons. When you think about the entire system, and where we start with, well, in the first place, what do we criminalize? And then how to apply those laws, and then how we apply those who are accused, and then in the end, how we punish those who are ultimately convicted. So that there are more and more questions, there'll be more and more workshops to deal with them. So let's have a second, third, fourth workshop, and we'll get somewhere in the end. Thank you.
So the floor is over to Aaron first, and then Tony.
I can't believe I've been asking question to Anthony Duff. I just wanted to know that do we also have to look at, I mean, my question is regarding the title of this symposium, which is, do we punish too much? What do we mean by we? Who are we talking about when we are saying we are punished? Do we also need to problematize this idea, who is the punishment speaking for? And who is the punishment speaking to? And do these questions around we are important when we are talking about this question of the punishment?
You're right. We need to think who is being talked about and who is talking. Often discussions about what we law-abiding, we good people do to them about it. And that's a very dangerous way of thinking. So we need to think carefully who the we are. Are we, I don't know what we do. I mean, what does the policy do? Because the law fixes in our name, don't it? So what should we do collectively as a policy? And that the policy includes those who are being punished and those who punish. So we should include everyone as part of the discussion. What are we to do, not about them, but about us? And we too are going to be those who are present. But the question is, we always think carefully about the voice we speak in, the pronoun we use.
And one very, very brief comment in a different direction, which is, it's also true, of course, if we think about international criminal law, things change quite dramatically. I mean, I don't think, I suspect everybody in this room thinks we punish too much domestically. I would hope that everyone in this room thinks we probably punish too little when it comes to crimes of mass atrocity and crimes against humanity. You know, what's happening in Myanmar or Syria, and I'm not naming the obvious one. You know, we're not over punishing in that domain, and that's an interesting point that follows from the we.
Who the we are there?
Who the we are there.
I wanted to pick up on, sorry, Tony Bottoms. I wanted to pick up on Matt's point about cardinal proportionality. Is it possible to say absolute terms how much is too much? And I completely agree with him in the abstract that it's actually impossible. And it's noticeable that Andreas von Hirsch, for example, who, as you said, largely developed initially this kind of thing, he never really attempted to produce an answer to that question. But I've wondered, thinking about this afternoon, and congratulations to the organisers for putting these various things together. But if we put together the previous session with this session, then maybe there's an interesting idea. The previous session, Peter Dawson was talking occasionally using the word legitimacy. And then John Wheatley was talking about difficulty of addressing people with regard to certain sorts of sentences, and it's getting harder because of the length of the sentences and so on. Doing the job of a prison governor properly has become harder because the messages we are required to transmit are less legitimate, was essentially the message coming through from the previous session. So while I completely agree with Matt that in absolute numbers it's impossible to talk about cardinal proportionality, might it be possible to say a test of we are punishing too much in terms of cardinal proportionality is that the people who are delivering the sentences are actually having serious difficulties in implementing them in a morally appropriate way?
Yes, I think there are a number of ways one might try to address the problem of cardinal proportionality, and that would certainly be one of them. My worry slightly, and it was the point made about ratcheting up, and is if over a sufficient amount of time longer sentences bed in, then will it be true that the next generation after that, prison governors and prison officers feel the same way? I mean, it just might become so normalized that those moral worries dissipate. Now, I do hope not, but that would be a worry about basing it on something like that. But I think, look, that would certainly be one way. I mean, another way might just be to say it costs a lot of money to keep people in prison and it's not doing any good. What are we doing it? And hoping that people will listen. But again, I'm not that optimistic because we've known it's expensive and inefficient for a long time, and that doesn't seem to change our behaviour. Anyway, there's lots of questions.
Next question, and then one over there.
My name's Gerard. I did a postgrad here about 9 years ago. I'm an ex-offender, and I also punish people in my work as magistrate. And what concerns me is that I believe I am psychologically punished, and I will be psychologically punished till I go to the grave because of the so-called hypocrisy of the Rehabilitation Offenders Act 1974, which was introduced to give ex-offenders the opportunity to have a clean slate. In fact, it says not to have a lifelong blot, let them get on in life. However, regardless of whether it's white-collar, blue-collar jobs, professions, enhancements at DBS, one always has to declare their criminal convictions. My first criminal conviction was 48 years ago. I'm 63 now. My last conviction was 34 years ago, and still I have to declare those convictions. I cannot, now I have a firearms license. Before I got that, I had to declare them. I was a psychiatric nurse. Before that, I had to declare them. As a magistrate, I had to declare them. It makes no difference. However, why is it that I still have to declare them when it has no effect whatsoever, but every time I go to a new place or want to do something, I don't want people to know. I want to forget. I'm embarrassed, ashamed. Now, why is it scholars, the best brains of Britain at Cambridge, why don't they seek government guidance to update the Rehabilitation Offenders Act so people like me can get on in life and have a clean slate?
I don't know the answer to the why don't they, but let me just say quickly, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think Anthony made the point and added that asking the question, are we using it appropriately, we don't just need to think about punishment, that's another way. We need to think about, for example, the afterlife of punishment, and precisely the things you describe. Is it appropriate to continue to demand people to do what they've demanded of you? Well, there might be circumstances in which it is. I work in the Scout Association by volunteering. There might be circumstances in which if you're working with small children, that there might be circumstances. But is it appropriate in general to demand of you forever and ever that you do this? No. But that's a question that's got at by asking the kind of appropriateness question. If we just think about punishment, and I think Anthony's whole life work in a way speaks to this, that if we get obsessed with punishment, we miss all the things that punishment will not the end, because then there's life after punishment. But we have to think about criminalisation. We have to think about police discretion, prosecutorial discretion, sentencing length, sentencing types, but afterlife of sentences. All that.
Write it for me, please.
Oh, sorry. So I think having a record is a good qualification to be a magistrate.
Say that again.
Having a record is a good qualification to be a magistrate.
So we have only 2 minutes. Two very quick questions here, and Emmanuel. Sorry, there are more hands up.
Hi, I'm Obi Tolu. I'm a former MPhil student here, and I'm a PhD student doing queer terrorism study. I just wanted to react to also like what my colleague said about who are the we, and I was also thinking about who are we actually punishing, which is also a way of extending what you just said and what my colleague just said about these questions that has so many. What do you say, black point, no, dark point, I don't know what to say. And I was just thinking about earlier when Peter Dawson and Tom Whitley, revealed to us in a very moving moment their own bodily feeling about what actually happens when you are the one who punishes or you're. I'm just thinking also of Carolyn's work, Carolyn Lenski's work on the families of people who are prosecuted. There's actually in the criminal justice system an entire constellation of people who are affected by punishment in tremendous ways, and there's no justification for that. And that just like creates a really important breach in that logic of whether it's reparative, whether it's that. There's the criminal justice system explodes with violence at many levels, right? I just wanted to point that out.
Sure. So Emmanuel, if you could.
I'll try. I'm Emmanuel from Ghana. There's a Ghanaian proverb that says that the deer will suffer, but the hunter would also suffer. The deer will suffer, but the hunter would also suffer. And this is the context that the hunter, depending on the context, uses a rifle or an arrow. So it's a projectile, it goes one way. But it has a way of coming back to hit the hunter. If 8 years means not necessarily the bullet or the arrow, but the repercussions. Okay. Why is it that when society thinks that you have more punitive measures against individuals, it doesn't some way, somehow, short, long term, come back to society? Yeah. Either in this generation or the other. What's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, look, so very, very quickly, I agree with the things you said. And I also think the disparities in treatment between some people and others. I mean, it often strikes me, quasi-Kwarteng and Liz Truss cost this country billions. Quasi-Kwarteng gave an interview where he said, I think we got carried away. And yet, I'm not suggesting we prosecuted, criminally prosecuted, but there's something really sad about the fact that he can say that. He can negligently just mention his negligence in spaffing, as Boris Johnson would say, however many billions up the wall. And yet, somebody who commits benefit fraud for 50 quid will end up being prosecuted. So there is something absolutely horrible about that, and I take the point. On the Hutch point, I agree. One of the arguments that changed my, I've always wondered whether there are really strong principled arguments about the death penalty, not arguments about, there are also practical reasons and so on. One of the arguments that really, it's not an argument, one of the facts that really changed my mind is there's an autobiography by one of the hangmen who operated. And at the end of the autobiography, he points out that when hanging was only carried out at one prison in England, they used to get, and I can't remember the number, something like 20 unsolicited letters a week from people asking to become hangmen, saying that they would volunteer to do the hanging. Now, if somebody says that having capital punishment does not corrupt public life and the idea of human dignity, then that paragraph seems to me exactly right. And it's exactly as you say, if we have more punitive, more penal justice system built more around the thought that people like us are nice, and then there are these horrible people over there who deserve to be punished, that corrupts everyone and it corrupts everything. And I didn't know the Nigerian saying, but I think it's a very powerful one.
Very briefly, there's a plug for all areas of work. Again, goes to who we are, who gets punished, and so on. The thought what matters is to try and cultivate the I-thou relationship. So we see the other, whether we as a prison officer, or wherever we are, we see the other as one of us. The shared humanity is crucial. If you can build on that and recognize the humanity of all those with whom you're dealing, including offenders and their families and their friends and so on, then that's the only way forward. Because that's a very hard thought to maintain. We can work towards that. That seems to me to be the best way we have.
So you can get the last word. Sorry. One tiny bit of tips for everyone who hasn't seen the news. The Labour Party manifesto, sorry, going back to something you said directly, the Labour Party manifesto has a paragraph in it about children of people in prison. And it says we need to pay more attention to protecting and the consequences for children of incarceration. So we've had a pretty miserable day already. We've had a lovely day, it's on news, but there's a little bit of happy news that at least if they do what's in the manifesto, which is a significant caveat.
Yeah.
Please do. That might be. Now I have to turn.
We have reached the final third, and I am immediately struck by the contrast between this and prison service events, where at the final third the room is almost empty. For the people who have found reasons to slip away for something more important. So we have a distinguished panel. My only job is to make sure that we finish by 6 o'clock, and I'm reliably informed that I can see Ben promised cheap white wine at the end of the event, so that'll wait for 6 o'clock. I'm going to invite each of our distinguished panel to speak for no longer than 5 minutes, just reflecting in any way they want on what they've heard during this. And I'm going to start at the following with Anta, who's, I think I've got your first name right, but no one's been able to tell me reliably how to pronounce your second name. So please introduce yourself.
Hi, yes, I'm Antje Dubois-Pedijn, and I'm Professor of Criminal Law and Philosophy at the Law Faculty here. And I was asked at the last minute to replace Julian Roberts, who I'm sure you might have rather, would have rather wanted to hear. I'm not going to use up my 5 minutes because this came up, yesterday. It was really like a last second replacement because Julian can't be here. And so I'm really reflecting on what I've heard this afternoon when I wasn't part of the one event, and therefore I wouldn't actually know what topics would be combined. And I think what is helpful for me is actually to carry on with Matt's reframing. Do we use the criminal justice system appropriately? Because I think that gets us in an appropriate way out away from the philosophy of punishment. As a philosophically inclined person myself, I can see a lot of value in the way in which, for instance, Leo approaches punishment and the balance of suffering within it. But I also think it is poisonous. It is poisonous to approach a public institution with anything that gives any positive balance to suffering, even though there may be a philosophical case to be made for it. And so I certainly think of what's happening in the criminal justice system. I think a healthy way of thinking about the criminal justice system is it's a system that is an institutional creation that is there to set reasonable terms for continued coexistence with those who break the rules that we have collectively created in society. And that means I want to take, and those reasonable terms will very often, and in fact, in my view, in principle, not include imposing suffering on people, because that is not for us as a collectivity to do. That may perhaps be appropriate in a certain setting where personal relations ensure also how people will refrain from things, will set limits, quite naturally set limits to how much suffering they impose. I think unless people are very cruel parents, they will perhaps at some point think, yes, my child needs to feel that, needs to be made to feel unhappy about what they've done, because otherwise they won't get the message, but they will also retract from that the moment they see the reaction. No collective system of what we do through the criminal justice system can create that nuance, can be that nuance. And that is the point I now quickly want to connect to what came out for me from the descriptions of prison governors and prison officers in how they run their job, because I think that is part of the constant tension you're facing. You are meant to do something that can only be done well if there is an interpersonal connection. But at the same time, in that you are hampered by this institutionalization, by this framework in which you operate. And that, I think, also means that we have to think about what kinds of places are prisons meant to be. If we really think that people need to be separated from ordinary social life for such an extent of their time, it seems to me the priority is to give them something meaningful to do. And that is perhaps also something that one can enable better than the sort of interpersonal caring relation, which is extremely difficult to sustain if you are thrown together as, on the one hand, it's your job to organize that things are run properly here, and on the other hand, you are just there because you have no choice about being there. So I leave it here as opening observations.
Thank you. Alice.
Thank you, Antje. I'm Alice Benson from the University of Liverpool. It's really nice to be here. It's nice to be here for several reasons, one of which is that I'm an alumna of the Prisons Research Centre and left about 2 years ago. And it's interesting that when I left and I started having to define my own research identity for myself rather than have it kind of given to me by membership of my research centre, I started calling myself started defining myself as someone interested in punishment and in the form of prisons rather than primarily prisons. as institutions. And I think that was kind of the reason for doing that is because I think it kind of does three things for me. The first is I think it's to do with not taking the institution in the current form it is for granted. I'm not an abolitionist in that I think that abolitionism is primarily a campaigning position. I'm not a campaigner, but I think that one of the things that one of the big values that abolitionism has for our conversation is pushing us to question why this thing is, why it is, and to not kind of accept it and see it as taken for granted. The other reason I think of myself as a punishment researcher is because I think it's really important to see the connection between prisons and the rest of the criminal justice process and broader society. So I'm really struck, as many others are, I think that we've had discussion today about how difficult it is to be the person who is tasked with implementing unjust punishment, and that the problem with one of the things that makes punishment unjust is just the sheer amount of time that is being given out. But as Nikki pointed out at the beginning, there are only a handful of people who are giving out sentences in the room. I think that's kind of interesting. And the other reason I think about myself as a punishment researcher these days is because I think it's an important way of deliberately looping the moral questions that imprisonment or different forms or modes of punishment raise into our analysis. So I think in my years researching prisons and talking to people who like research and teach on prisons, I think everyone I've ever spoken to, who I'm aware of, is either motivated by some sort of moral driver, or when they get into the prison world is kind of constantly faced with moral questions. I think they're kind of always there. But I think very often when we write and when we talk, we either ignore those moral questions, we put them to one side and just talk about our findings, or we kind of state our moral impulses without kind of fully exploring or pushing them. So we'll kind of state them as universals without questioning them. And I think it's important for us as punishment researchers to kind of keep making those moral questions part of our analysis, if that makes sense. So just briefly, if have we got time? So...
We're doing terribly well.
Great. I was asked a bit to answer the question, do we punish too much? Are there conditions in which it is acceptable? So the justification of punishment that I am most tempted by, I think, although I think it doesn't justify punishment as we do it, is the idea of moral communication. So the idea that what we're supposed to do with punishment is be saying something about the wrongness of something that has been done. And the reason I'm tempted by it is because I think it's important for victims, I think, to not do something in response to a serious wrong that has been done still says morally communicate something. So I think we need to kind of demonstrate our willingness to change the world or do something about serious acts of harm. I also think there's a kind of, when people have committed really serious wrongs, I think there's a way in which it's also a morally appropriate response to that, to kind of realise and think about the fact that you have done something seriously wrong. So I think that makes it easier for us to kind of live alongside each other. I'm thinking about friends I have who have committed really, really serious crimes, and it would be, I know have, and it would be difficult for me to be friends with them if they thought those crimes were okay. I think it's totally fine for me to be friends with them knowing that they think that those things were wrong. But so I think I'm tempted by that as a justification for a response to criminal harm, but I'm not convinced that we do it very well in prisons. And for all of the reasons that have been talked about today, Alison has talked about it a lot as well. I wrote a book that came out last year which argues this point. And it's based on a kind of semi-ethnographic study of an English prison for men convicted of sex offences, specifically. And it tries to argue that one of the things what we do with punishment is punish people so excessively in a way which is also very unclear. So it sends a very unclear message, which is kind of both too broad and too harsh and too submerged, with the effect that people feel that like they are turned into an object, into an it, and they are more likely to spend their time resisting the connotations of the label that has been placed on them, rather than kind of reflecting on anything that they have done. And I am going to stop there. I think.
Hey, Nick, you have been set two fabulous examples. Feel free to follow.
Thank you. So I'm Hardwick. I'm currently a professor of criminal justice at Royal Holloway, which is part of the University of London, and I've had various roles. To some extent, ensuring people or delivering punishment, or in the administration of punishment in the criminal justice system. And I want to agree a bit with what Alice has said. So first of all, related to what Ben said, I think sending someone to even the best run prison for even a short period of time is a very serious punishment indeed. So I wouldn't kind of detract from that point. And secondly, I think the way in which we use prison sentences at the moment is so severe that it's disproportionate and loses legitimacy. Right? But with those provisos, I don't resile from the idea that a function of prison, and I would argue actually its most important function, is punishment. And I'll argue that on this basis. I think that the evidence for deterrence working is, I think, as Ben was saying, I think it is at best unclear. I think if anything, the evidence that deterrence works is highly questionable. And the evidence that rehabilitation works, I'm not one of those people who thinks that nothing works, but I do think we don't know what works, and we don't know what works for who, right? And I think about the debate about IPP prisoners. If all we've done with IPP prisoners is said you need to be punished for what you did, there'd be none in there at the moment. It's we keep them in because we think somehow or other we'll be able to fix them. Right? If we just said, okay, you nicked all those bones, you're going to do a sentence as your punishment, they'll all be out by now. Right? It's the extras we try to build into prisons that create sometimes, I think, the depth and tightness that Ben talks about, for instance. So I think punishment is legitimate. And I've been thinking about this for a long time, and one of I'll just briefly describe a moment that really made me think about this. And I was at one of the Longford lectures last year. So people who had been to a Longford lecture, 1,000 people perhaps packed in, hundreds packed into Church House, full of, I guess, people with similar attitudes towards the people in this room. And it was last year, I think, that the speaker was Nina Smallman, whose two daughters had been murdered in a park in Wembley, right? And she spoke very powerfully about forgiveness of the man who committed those offences, right? And then she went off script a bit, I think, and she said, "But I can't forgive the two police officers who took those degrading pictures of her murdered daughters and shared them on WhatsApp." And the Longford audience, I think, we all sort of muttered in agreement with what she was saying, right? And those two police officers received sentences, I think it was 2 years and 9 months. So what for? There's no deterrence value in that. They weren't going to do the same thing again. They wouldn't have the opportunity to do the same thing again, right? They didn't need to be sort of rehabilitated. They received those sentences as an expression of it's expressive of our revulsion at the offence they committed. I think that was the right thing to do. I think that was the right thing to do. But that punishment in itself, even if it had no rehabilitative function, even if it had no deterrent function, I think it was the right thing to do. And in other roles I've had, like where you deal with big injustices, right? What you hear with from the families of people who've been killed by police officers, or the victims of Hillsborough, or what people run for, what people ask for is justice. Right? And they don't mean by justice a sort of chat with the perpetrator. They mean that the perpetrator should be punished. Right? So I don't result from the idea of punishment, but I do think that the way in which we punish at the moment is so disproportionate and lacks so much legitimacy that it's not acceptable. So then that raises the question, okay, what would be legitimate? How would you then, what would be legitimate? And I offer these. Okay, that's right. Now look at this one. Just so you know, obviously you need to think about these first. So first of all, I would say that of course punishment isn't the only function of prisons. So we shouldn't punish either for imprisonment, either for so long or so harshly that it makes the possibility of rehabilitation and change impossible. Right? So that punishment should allow the possibility and help create the possibility of change and reform. So it shouldn't be too. That for me would be the proportion element. Secondly, that punishment should be decided by the state, not the victim. Right? Now, I think one of the quite worrying things that then about the dialogue is the extent to which, and this sounds a harsh thing to say, that we have to be careful about how we use the voice of victims in determining punishment, because I think in those circumstances the punishment becomes purely, the danger becomes purely retributive, and it's difficult to make it. How can you proportionate a legitimate? Thirdly, I think it shouldn't be cruel and degrading. It should be abide by human rights standards. And fourthly, it should take into account the agency of the person involved. So a child or someone with mental health problems, that's a different matter. So I think you would start to think about what are the constraints on punishment, right, in prison, that would enable us to have a debate with the wider public, perhaps in maybe a moment. Because I think, I really value the fact that this seminar has chosen this topic, because I think outside this room, lots of people do talk about that in terms of what they think of as being the purpose of prisons, what prisons are for, and how that plays into the argument of overcrowding. And for my part, I say, yeah, okay, I agree. Some things we need to express our disapproval through punishment. But then I think we can get into a discussion about the limits to punishment, which simply avoiding the subject doesn't enable us to do. So I hope that this discussion here is part of something that will continue, and I'm thank you for organising.
Yeah, we have 6 minutes, right? Righty, lots and lots and lots. Maria, you haven't had a go yet, and I know your name.
Maria, a member of the party. I'm puzzled by the example given by the last speaker with regards to the two policemen who deserved punishment, to use the words, because it was a form of expression. And I don't really see how that will be, forgive me for saying it, how this will be different to an earlier example that was used with regards to the punishment of young kids who committed murders a couple of decades ago. And I'm wondering how this contradicts the whole concept of rehabilitating people, especially those people who are involved in punishment, front line, if you like, because I'm wondering whether, even though that was a one-off offense and mistake that possibly they do regret, I'm wondering whether this, them perceiving an illegitimate punishment as opposed to being rehabilitated, creates longer-term corrupt culture or sustained problematic culture that exists already in the community. Forgive me for saying this.
Well, first of all, the other points I made is I think the agency of the perpetrator comes into play. So I think that how we deal with children who committed serious offences, or how we deal with people with mental health problems who committed serious offences, is different than how we deal with people who don't have those issues. So I think agency comes into it. And I would say, look, there's downsides to all of this. So I'm not saying I would accept punishing people has negative implications for some of the people who be liberated, and I think it has a wider, there are other negative implications to it. Right? But I think that not acknowledging and expressing our concern about the harm done, I think the negative consequences of that are great. But what I would say is, I think if we're going to punish people in prison, if it becomes so disproportionate that it prevents any potential for rehabilitation and change, then that's what would be something that in my view would be disproportionate. So when I'm arguing for punishment, I think, and I hope I made it clear, I think we do it to excess and disproportionately and illegitimately, and disproportionately in every sense of the word at the moment. So I'm not, but I don't have I would argue it is a purpose, and probably the most legitimate purpose.
In the interest of getting as many people as possible.
So yeah, just to kind of respond almost directly to that. I just wanted to question. So we have, as it stands right now, prison has a tri purpose, right? Retribution, punishment, and rehabilitation. So if we look at that just looking at what we're talking about right now, we look at that in terms of like means testing. So now, in its purest form, let's just say, for example, it works, we're doing it well. Would that then mean that if somebody didn't meet that means test, i.e., there'd be no retribution, or retribution didn't work, or punishment didn't work, or any one of the three or more, then should that person still go to prison? Because then prison is serving different purposes for different people. Therefore, you're going to send someone to prison just for punishment, but that person can't be rehabilitated, but as you said yourself.
That's answered the question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. Do you want to?
Maybe we should connect it to your questions.
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, we haven't got time. So you can tell us Thursday. So let's try and pick it up. Seriously, we've got 2 minutes. So
We can go over 5 minutes.
oh, you're just changing the rules. Yeah, come on then. Let's add your question.
When you said before that you don't think victims should have a say on how people are punished, I think the post office scandal and the hundreds of lives that were affected by the few, I think they should have a say-so of how those few are going to be punished.
I think, right, what I think is I disagree, right? I think, right, that we should listen to victims in terms of bringing people to justice and the courts. And the problems with both the post office and Hillsborough and other examples is we haven't listened to, in the ways that Swain describes it, voices from below who are telling us what's happening and we ignored them, right? So I would listen to victims up to the point, right, where we are deciding the punishment. I wouldn't have the post office masters and mistresses deciding any penalty portobello should have, right? I would involve them much better in actually bringing the if there are guilty parties to justice, to the courts. But I wouldn't have victims decide punishment.
I'm going to reassert an element of control. Your question, and Leo, you also had a question, didn't you? So let's do it in that order.
I don't think I'll be able to ask my question in a very short time. So if anyone else is,
yeah. No, come on. That's fine.
No, I mean, I don't know. I think this is more sort of an observation of attending this great symposium, and I think it started with this idea of integrating practice with philosophy. And I think what this sort of told us is that there is some inherent tensions in not only the normative definition of punishment, but also normative value of punishment as a response to wrongdoing. And I don't think that I got a clearer answer as to why punishment should be a response to a wrongdoing in the first place, let alone justifying its normative value. And it's coming from my experience of how punishment is done in India, or any global south jurisdiction, which was hardly discussed today, where the realities are that 75% of incarcerated people are under trial. So their guilt is not being proven. Majority of people suffer violence not in prisons, but in police custody, detention centers, and extrajudicial violence. And these sort of these sociological realities sort of destabilize not only our normative value that we find in punishment, but also our understanding of punishment being a response, a justifiable response to what we perceive as wrongdoing. So I think I just wanted to ask that would this struggle that we are facing, that are we punishing too much, are we not punishing too much? How can we on a scale very mathematically draw proportionality? Would these tensions and discomfort continue unless we ask whether punishment should be a normative response to what we see as wrong? Or punishment as we understand it, which is actually Hart's definition of.
That's a fabulously big question for 6:01, so I'm going to invite Angela and Alice to respond. Alice.
I not going to be a direct answer, but it's going to be what I was thinking while you were talking, which I think kind of gets us somewhere. For all that I said at the beginning, that I see myself as a punishment researcher, I also don't find punishment a very useful word to describe if we're doing something too much or not enough. And there is someone, and I suspect some of the proper philosophers of punishment in the room might know who this was. It might have been Martha Nussbaum, who said that we should stop using the word punishment for a bit. If we're talking about whether we're doing it too much or too little, it's a word that means everything and nothing. It means putting someone on probation, or it means sending someone to prison, or it means executing them, and then kind of we lose ourselves a bit. So I think that, do I think that anything that we do I think that the criminal justice system in this country is in any way legitimate or humane or justifiable or moral? No. Do I think that what you are describing in India is in any way legitimate or justifiable or moral or acceptable? No. Do I think that something should happen when something bad has happened? Yes. Do I think that should be punishment? Well, that just depends what you mean by punishment. Those statements I know to be true. I'm not sure about the next step.
I can't come in here to provide the next step. I think it's really important, however, to keep these two issues distinct. What do we as a polity do through means that involve the use of force on behalf of the public, however defined, and what happens, what should happen ideally in some community when one member of the community does something that is disapproved of by the others for good reason. All right, these for me are not necessarily unconnected questions, but it really helps to keep them separate, because it helps to just accept the limitations of the meaning that what you do in the political community through the state can actually happen. Is it meaningful or meaningless if someone who 50 years ago was a concentration camp guard gets put before a court now? It's kind of unanswerable. It's probably not something that now serves the core functions of the criminal justice system. Is it meaningful if someone who has committed yet another petty theft is put before a magistrate again? And the magistrate says, "You here again? What are we going to do with you now? Shall I send you to prison now because it's the 10th time? And you always tell me you're not going to do it again. And yet you do." If we ask, that's why this question, do we want to use this particular response system to socially problematic behavior? When does it become pointless to use it? When is it not perhaps pointless, but really also not going to appear very meaningfully on the moral ledger? These are questions that I think help us to focus, and certainly focus the public debate on who ends up in prison, for what, for how long, and what does it do to that person's life. And then you can have a public debate about, say, the pointlessness of over-punishing. You can have a conception of over-punishing, because if people can't be released into lives that they can still meaningfully lead, then you have certainly over-punished. You've overdone it somehow. And whether you deal with it, I think a lot needs to actually happen. And in a way, I would like to bring you into this answer as well, because when I think of prison, and I have to admit, I've never been inside a prison, but I've seen footage of prisons. And the footage that seems at first sight so extremely depressive is like the colors of the walls, the way how this entire place looks so drab. It seems really oppressive, you know, so that I would actually wonder how can anybody, you know, retain their sanity. So this, I think, is something that we need to think about. Yeah. How much do we want to invest in miserable
Okay,
places?
no. The board's come back to me and I've got a big question in front of me and we've had more than our 5-minute extension. Unfortunately, there is the opportunity for people to continue all these conversations. It's traditional in these things, so what are we going to do about it? I'm going to try very briefly to say the one thing that I think it's realistic to think about doing. Several people have said we've got a general election coming up with the likelihood of a new government, possibly with a big majority. On day one, the new Justice Secretary is not going to have a civil servant go into the room and say, so Justice Secretary, what do you think the meaning of punishment is? They're going to say, there are only 3 beds left in Wandsworth. What do you want to do about it? I think the challenge really for people like us who are thinking about it is to somehow to find a way of saying, as well as thinking about the 3 beds left in Wandsworth, how are you going to think deeply so that your decisions do come back to some kind of understanding, however you get to it, whatever it turns out to be, but that you have some kind of moral framework, some kind of deep thought behind all the hundreds of decisions you will then take. And I'm thinking about how we help people to think that deeply is worthwhile, because it's obviously happened here. It happens all the time here. And if you don't do it, then you are literally rudderless. I was very taken by what you said, Anthony, about the value of seeing the people, seeing who we is and who we are doing this to. And if you can make that happen, if you can literally make the human being who is on the receiving end of all the decisions we take real, it's very difficult, once that's happened, to ignore it in the rest of your thinking. It ceases to be an intellectual exercise. So that's a challenge to make that happen. A brilliant afternoon. Say it's very rare to have so many people stay for the whole thing and be energized and interested throughout. So thank you very much. Thank you to the people who organised it, and do stay for a drink.